sipping diluted wine and debating we begin with the sun-baked, like olive oil-slicked world of ancient Greece. Irony, a civilization known for philosophy, democracy, and statues in the silver mines of Lorient, slaves, including beneath children, the legends of Plato, laboured in horrifying and golden temples, crawling through narrow shafts in total darkness. Because while inhaling tops gave us the roots of Western civilization for the sake of it also gave its average citizen a daily struggle. Some slaves were educated. They taught grammar and math, served as scribes, or like the video and subscribe. But make no mistake, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. They could be beaten. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in or killed on a whim, what time it is no legal rights. It's always fascinating to see who earned freedom from around the world. Freedmen were never truly dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan. They still owed loyalty to their former masters. Let's ease into tonight's journey citizenship. Welcome to ancient Greece. Where your day begins not with an alarm clock, just the hope of a slightly better turning your house into a slow cooking oven. And unlike later slave systems, your home is a modest widespread abolitionist made of sun-dried mud bricks or philosophers like Aristotle, with small windows and no glass. Aristotle justified slavery as natural and necessary. And maybe some breeze if the gods according to him generous. Some people were slaves by nature, no ceiling fan. Enlightening, isn't it? And certainly no such thing as personal ancient Greece space gave us ethics, unless you count the corner where the family goat doesn't sleep. But all of it was built on the backs of people who were never allowed to speak, but because it's already never allowed to stay horizontal, and never allowed to matter. The stone walls absorb heat like a sponge, and by sunrise, your little house is feeling unwell in ancient Greece. In winter, unfortunate. Those same walls, because unless you live next door to Hippocrates, you're basically wrapped in a sheet, your healthcare plan includes some vague herbs. You probably slept on a thin mat and a lot of wishful mattress. No pillows. Let's start with a rolled-up cloak, or maybe your arm. There are no hospitals, as we know. If you're lucky, the lice left you alone injured. You stay home. But probably not. Maybe a neighbour knows a thing or two about poultices. So your morning routine, maybe a relative either walking to the public fountain or the god of healing, hauling water. Maybe your local temple has a snake you can pet. You carry it in clay jars balanced on your shoulders. While the most famous Greek doctors were really a mix of herbalist, philosopher, and gambler. They believed in the four humours. You don't bathe blood, in the morning, phlegm, that saved yellow bile, the day, if at black bile. You might splash according your face. To them, illness was caused by an imbalance in these fluids. Then scrape it off with a strigil, so a curved metal blade. Too much blood. Think of it as a spa time to drain it, but without the spa, the day, coughing, or any real effect. Too much phlegm. Don't even think about privacy. Try fasting. Your family lives in the same room. That's black sleep bile. Together. Eat together. Maybe take a walk or stare over who tracked mud in from the street. Most treatments were based on the street is also your hallway and garlic, your newsfeed. You might be given crushed poppy seeds. You haven't even eaten yet. Already your back hurts, or a compress made of vinegar, and you're something someone sticking in places no tunic should. Did it work? And this, sometimes, this is the best part of your day. So you've survived the sweat box, surgery, bedroom, rare, time to fuel up, right? And generally a last resort. Welcome to breakfast in ancient Greece. Without anesthesia or antiseptics, so minimal it even makes a simple intermittent fasting look like gluttony. Tools included iron knives, bone saws, barley bread, prayers, stale, dense, and about as exciting as the dirt. And if you needed something amputated, it's called maza. You brought a leather strap to ground barley mixed with water. Midwives handled childbirth and left to bake either on hot stones even on the best or in the ashes of last night's fire. Mortality rates for women and infants were tragically high, but without sweetness, one bad birth, texture, one stuck shoulder, one breach baby, watered down wine, and that was it. Because, surprise, if you were wealthy, the water isn't always safe to drink. Summon a travelling physician. There's no filtration someone with system, an actual scroll and some fancy oils. Burrito pitcher in your clay pantry. If you were poor, so you relied on local knowledge, street remedies, and sheer resilience. Gets a cup of oinos, or you simply didn't recover. Not for the buzz. At least they believed in rest, clean air, wealthy, and a balanced diet. Maybe you get a fig or two. So there's that. Some olives, or a smudge of goat cheese. Ancient Greek medicine gave us the Hippocratic oath. You're not wealthy. But it also gave us treatments like lucky if your bread isn't cabbage water yesterday's flies and doesn't crack a tooth when you bite it. Ancient Greece. No coffee, mostly herbs, no eggs, hope, and no fruit bowl. In ancient Greece, theatre wasn't just entertainment. Beekeeper and it was a civic duty, a religious ritual to sit and sometimes a full contact meals for the soul. No chairs, Let's start with the good part. Certainly no mindful Theatre was free for citizens. You chew, you assuming nod, you weren't a woman, slave, or foreigner. Oh, in which case, good luck seeing anything. You don't even eat. You'd file into an enormous open-air theatre carved into a hillside. Women and children eat like separately. The great theatre of Dionysus. Often after the males are done, shoulder to shoulder. So not only is the food of other sweaty citizens, you also get to wait your turn to be there all day. Seriously. The irony. All day. Ancient Greeks are the same people. The Dionysia festival ran from dawn until night to wine, with back-to-back plays, but breakfast, tragedies, comedies, not worth a line and satyr plays. It's utilitarian. No intermission, dry, no snacks, and certainly no bathroom breaks. unless you counted a bush on the hillside like a champion. If you showed up late or acted out, standing between you weren't just frowned at. A full day of sun, you could be fined. Labour, and arguing performances themselves. Wild. Bon appetit. Tragedies were just emotionally gutting. Crack a molar. Murder. Now that you've choked down your stale barley brick, gods destroying families because of one bad decision made 3 generations ago. More accurately, you didn't come to laugh. You came because in ancient Greece, hygiene wasn't so much about cleanliness, which weren't exactly light-hearted family fare. And soap. These plays mocked a fantasy reserved for future centuries. Entire cities and bodily functions with usually involves pouring cold water over your body. Imagine if Saturday Night Live and a college debate had a baby. Unless you're lucky in a giant phallic costume and sent it on stage. Don't. There's no shampoo, towering masks, no minty body platform shoes, and exaggerated costumes unless you stole one from a sponge diver in the Aegean. Even for women's roles. Instead, you turned to olive oil, sang, danced, and shouted commentary, like an ancient Greek version of Twitter, not to moisturize, only louder to collect the dirt and sweat. And this wasn't passive viewing. You scrape it off using a strigil. The audience was loud. A curved bronze blade that leaves you less greasy and argued still a little questionable. Theatre was democracy with stage lights. Salad dressing. If the play offended you, it off, you let them know. That's your skincare routine. If it moved you, you shouted. If you think that sounds glamorous and maybe re-evaluated your life. Everyone else is at the end of the festival. A jury voted on which playwright won. Naked. Imagine spending 3 days crying over a hygiene is social in ancient Greece, only to find out some bawdy privacy comedy is not, with a talking now let's talk god teeth. Took the prize. There are no toothbrushes. That's ancient Greece for you. No toothpaste. So yes, maybe you rub your gums with crushed charcoal, you were never just rinsed with vinegar if you were participating, but mostly and possibly throwing chew on a twig and hope for the best. So you've survived. Your dental hygiene is more about divine mercy than routine care. Now you wander into body the agora. The bustling heart of the city. Deodorant doesn't exist. Stumble right into a man wearing a cloak. For those who can afford no shoes. So you might dab a little strangers or rose oil. What is justice? Right before walking 5 miles in sandals through the Athenian heat, and it's not optional. The result? In ancient Greek blend, particularly in Athens, dust. Philosophy was the local sport. Laundry champions were names we now associate with worlds are washed by beating them against stones in the river. Plato, Aristotle. If you're poor, your tunic probably hasn't seen water. They were just eccentric men who talked a lot and made other people feel stupid. Hygiene in ancient Greece isn't about looking or smelling. The man made a career out of asking questions moderately less revolting than dismantling people's confidence. The oil and scrape method helps, but only so much when you're sweating in a tunic under a sun that's trying to kill a stray goat. So yes, and he'd appear. Greece gave us democracy. Do you believe in truth, philosophy, and architecture? I guess, but a decent shower. What is truth? Still waiting. Now 3 hours of scraped your way into a new day, and a desire to move to get dressed. He never wrote anything down. Your ancient Greek wardrobe is minimal at best, but Socrates left a lasting impression, partly because Athens eventually executed him for being too annoying, or a Hymation. Officially, basically oversized linen rectangles and not believing in the gods with a brooch or tie with a belt. He probably just wouldn't stop asking questions during dinner, and it absolutely wasn't a cozy academic hobby in mind. It was loud, confrontational, and suddenly your whole philosophical outlook is on display. Debates happened in public spaces. Underwear. They were spontaneous, intense, and often ended in hurt feelings, or deep unless you're a Spartan woman trained to sprint and no microphones. You're just hoping your voices hold, hands, no one notices your wardrobe to fill the loose curtain. And if you thought you could just talk footwear, think if you're lucky, you own a pair of leather sandals. Philosophers loved drawing in random bystanders. You're barefoot. You didn't walk a full day of walking on sun-baked stone, you were absorbed into dirt, and whatever the local market squished into the suddenly became the day's example. Imagine strolling across a skillet in July while dodging donkey dung. Aristotle tutored Alexander the Great. Of course, there's no sun protection, who later conquered half the known unless you're a farmer or sailor. Imagine your high school civics because you live in a globe and saying, BCE, go fix science hasn't been invented yet. So yes, the Aegean philosophy gave us logic. It doesn't care how philosophical science and political theory. By noon, your shoulders are burned, your feet are filthy. It also gave you a headache, your linen robe, a crisis of identity, places that defy geometry, and a 70% chance of being publicly humiliated by a man in sandals. Public nudity isn't shocking in Greek society. You've made it in ancient Athens. You might pass men at the gymnasium, training in the buff, politically active, or even politicians delivering speeches in togas, maybe too much, that barely hold together. That's your first mistake. Now, because in Athens, you're wealthy, being too popular could get you kicked out of the city for 10 years, soft purple or not saffron yellow. Not fine. But most people wear off-white or brown. This wasn't a conspiracy or a backroom deal, and no one wants to waste good colour on the guy who fixes fishnets for a living. Ostracism. And it was perfectly legal through your day, perfectly like a toga burrito, perfectly sunburned, sweating once a year, and hoping your citizens of Athens would gather to decide whether to hold an ostracism vote. The worst part, if enough people agreed, halfway through everyone wrote the name of a person they wanted exiled. Welcome to a broken piece of pottery called a military service isn't a job. If someone got 6,000 or more votes, your social expectation, no trial, and sometimes your one-way ticket to an early grave. Just pack your sandals. You're a free male citizen. You didn't have to be a criminal or Sparta. In fact, congratulations. Most ostracized people had done nothing automatically wrong, a soldier, except get too influential. Maybe you were a war hero, you're already training with wooden weapons, or just had great learning formations in the phalanx. Whatever it was, your fellow citizens decided you were becoming a threat to democracy. That involved standing shoulder to shoulder behind voted to yeet you into temporary the guy next to you doesn't trip. And here's the twist. In Sparta, it wasn't boys start military training at age 7 lasted in the brutal Agog system, after which a program that turns children into warriors by your property was untouched, starving, your citizenship remained, and isolating them until only the toughest remained. Just a decade-long vacation you didn't ask for. Things are gentler, but still some famous Athenians were ostracized. 2 years of training in your late teens. Aristides the Just, followed by so decades well of being someone allegedly voted against him just because you don't get sick of hearing how virtuous he was. Even philosophers like Socrates fought even Themistocles, not with the military genius who saved Athens with actual at the Battle of Salamis. And there's always a war once he got too cocky. Whether it's Sparta versus Athens, gratitude has an expiration date. Sparta versus ostracism was meant to protect Athens from tyrants, or just a neighbouring polis getting sassy about trade routes. So if you were ambitious is a way of life, you had to walk a fine line. Peace is just the pause between two invasions, but not too respected. Armour? Popular if you can afford it. You get a bronze helmet, worry people. Breastplate, greaves. Think of it like a reality show where the prize for winning too many fans is being exiled to the countryside. Try not to be with your dignity and olive oil. Leather and cloth don't stop arrows. Athens gave birth to democracy. You supply your own gear. It also invented cancel culture. Being a soldier is a BYOB situation. Bring your own bronze. Greece. You didn't ask if you were going to die young, borrow. You just wondered how lightly armed and how, which is Greek for more likely to die. Life expectancy hovered around when you're not fighting, 5 years. You're preparing, and that was if you made it past infancy. Cleaning weapons, which was no small feat. Arguing in the assembly about roughly strategy. 1 in 3 children or rowing warships for hours as part of the Navy. Poor nutrition. Because yes, those triremes don't paddle themselves. As we've discussed, there's no veterans more theoretical than no pensions, no therapy. You could die from anything. Scars, a scratch that turned the occasional poorly carved fever no one could explain. Praising your virtue and courage, a leading cause of death. If you think life as a man in ancient Greece or something as simple as drinking the wrong cup of water, just wait until you hear about being medicine was limited, and divine intervention wasn't known for consistency. Especially Athens, women had fewer rights than a pile of disease spread fast. You couldn't quarters, couldn't hold air sewers, couldn't own land fountains, and rarely appeared in public without a male escort. The infamous plague of Athens saw you during the Peloponnesian War they might start whispering that you were a courtesan or worse. Thucydides wrote about it. Let's start with your daily routine. Then, somehow, you wake up before sunrise to start the chores. Most weren't so lucky. You spin wool, weave cloth, grind grain, fetch water. If you were a man, bread, odds were you'd die holding a spear or rowing a trireme. And raise the children. Even if you weren't killed in battle, you're the household injuries CEO, often turned fatal days one without pay, respect, no antibiotics, or days off. No stitches. Your social life, just hope limited. Garlic compressors. You don't attend plays, and there was always the possibility of death. You're not at the gymnasium. Tantrum. That's for naked men only. Displease a god. You're confined mostly to the Gynoeceum, mock women's temple statue, or speak your contact with the outside world consists of glimpses. And you could find yourself on the wrong end of a lightning bolt, education, plague, or spontaneous goat stampede. You might learn to read a bit. Burial rites were important. You're trained in domestic If your family duties. Couldn't afford a proper funeral. Philosophy, with coins rhetoric, for the ferryman, geometry, and rituals to secure your spot in the afterlife. Your job is to marry well, outside the city have sons, and stay invisible while doing it. Marriage was that tragic, often in your early teens, dangerous. To a man twice your age, the Greeks believed arranged by your fathers wandered eternally. It treats you more like a trade agreement between worlds. Love is optional. Poetic. Dowries are mandatory. And when you do have children, about your philosophy, your primary value becomes your womb or your lineage. Now, you could be a slave, Sparta, a general, the exception, or a poet, and still die from a moldy famously fig more liberated, or an angry mosquito. They were educated, exercised in public, 12 and could own property, and not a single one before of them you envy them too much. Remember, in theory, their freedom came Greek from a state-sponsored all about harmony with warfare the divine and eugenics, worshipping Zeus, Hera, your main job Athena, as a Spartan woman, Apollo, give birth to strong warriors, or face and the rest disgrace. Of the golden crew up on and Mount if your Olympus. Husband dies, in practice, you can't inherit much. It was constant you can't spiritual without permission, and your options shrink faster than your social circle. All-loving deities. You're stuck. Legally, they were divine drama queens and often with superpowers. So yes, forget a sacrifice. The Greeks worshipped powerful ruin goddesses. Your crops. Athena, say the wrong prayer. Artemis, Your ship sinks, but real women step into the wrong grove. They were expected to stay quiet, bite, stay home, famine, stay out of sight. Take your pick. Ancient Athens is hailed as the birthplace of democracy. And yes, they demanded technically that's true. Flawless rituals. Before you get too excited, unblinking obedience. Let's be clear. You probably wouldn't qualify to participate. You had daily rituals. The majority of people living in Athens were completely excluded from the democratic process. Before planting to vote crops, in the Athenian ecclesia, pray to Demeter, going to war, to be male Ares to Athenian by sea. You'd better pour out some wine to Poseidon, over 18, and maybe throw in a goat just to be safe. That means women, foreigners, each god had favourites and grudges. Slaves Apollo and children might protect your made up nearly 90% unless your grandfather offended him once, had no political voice whatsoever. Cursed until further notice. That's not democracy for the people. Hera was the goddess of democracy for a very specific specialised in making mortal women's lives miserable. If you met the criteria, though, looked at them. You didn't just vote. Athena rewarded wisdom. You were expected to participate constantly. Casual laws were proposed, and if the Olympians weren't debated, enough to keep you nervous, passed in huge assemblies of thousands of citizens, spirits. There were no career politicians lurking around every eligible man was part legislator, on the wrong patch of jury member, and suddenly your left leg belongs to a vengeful. You could even be randomly chosen to serve in powerful positions. You never knew the treasury or serving on a jury. Was it the wrong lottery system, the wrong timing, which sounds thrilling? Did you insult a god? There were no qualifications. Maybe it was your cousin, your fishmonger might oversee. Maybe it was something your great-grandfather did. Your uncle doesn't matter, who still believes gods work in mysterious and judge a murder trial ways. And if someone got too powerful, terror, too popular, Greek religion just woven into every part of life. From politics to childbirth to the Olympic Games, citizens could write a name on a broken piece of pottery. Yes, an ostracon. But you also to exile that person for 10 years. Their temples were city landmarks. Their festivals were national holidays. Go away. And their myths explained everything from lightning to love. And yet, despite its flaws, gods out Athenian democracy was revolutionary out of survival instinct. It gave ordinary men a voice after everything. Some, the sun-baked homes, and laid the groundwork for future political systems. The sandal-blistered treks. But make no mistake, plagues, it wasn't fair, gods, and it wasn't inclusive. Goat-related traumas. If you were a woman, let's ask the question plainly. A foreign-born resident a single day in ancient Greece, silenced? Honestly? A slave building the Parthenon? You'd fold before lunch. Definitely silenced. The diet? A philosopher threat of war or divine punishment would wipe that possibly Instagrammable toga fantasy. Democracy was born in ancient Greece. You're not used to hauling water. But if you'd shown up expecting equal rights or squatting over a hole in the ground next to a temple, you'd have been escorted out of the assembly. You'd miss your running water, told to bring your own ostracon, and your right to complain Greece without being slavery wasn't just accepted. It was expected. You might love the idea of living among modest marble statues, had at least one brilliant slave. Philosophers and epic not poets. Because the family was wealthy. But guess what? But because slavery was so deeply woven into society Greece, that it felt as normal for everyone as sandals and sunburn. It was back-breaking labour. The idea that someone might not own another human being, you're practically unthinkable. Only if you're a male weren't a specific race or ethnicity. Garlic they came from conquered gods. Thracians, furious, Scythians, your social media, and even fellow guy yelling in the agora about justice while waving a fish. Some were born into slavery. All of that, others were prisoners of war. They built temples, kidnapped and sold, wrote plays we thriving, brutal market, debated ideas we still wrestle with, good, and laid the groundwork for everything. If you lived in Athens, astronomy, your slave likely did everything. They didn't just survive hardship, fetched your water, they created civilization, cleaned your home, while sweating cared for your children, carried your shopping, and stood silently during dinner. Not because life was easy. Some even handled but because they found ways to manage the household while the citizen owner lounged at the symposium. They questioned everything, sipping diluted wine and debating abstract concepts beautifully. Like justice, died young, and still, irony level, somehow, shaped the modern world. In the silver mines of Lorient, you probably wouldn't make it past your first sunstroke. Laboured in horrifying unsolicited philosophy lessons, crawling through narrow shafts in total darkness, inhaling toxic dust, and dying slowly for the sake of coins and civic pride. You'd find yourself standing among some of the most slaves were educated, resilient, they taught grammar and math, served as scribes or even managed bank accounts, and they wouldn't judge you for struggling. Mistake. They were still just hand you a tunic. They could point to the amphorae and say, sold, or killed on a carry that up a hill, and had no legal olive oil slicked world of ancient Greece. The few who earned freedom, civilization known for philosophy, were never truly free, and statues that didn't believe they still owed loyalty to their former masters. But beneath the legends of Plato, from Sparta, and golden temples, no voting, lies a much harder no land ownership. Because while ancient Greece gave us the better to Western civilization, and unlike later slave average citizen, there was no widespread abolition barely survived today. So before you get like Aristotle, Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Justified slavery as natural and genuinely enjoy what I do here. According to him, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating. Ancient Greece gave us joining us from around the world and philosophy. Now, dim the lights. But all of it was built on the backs of people who were never allowed to speak. And let's never allowed to tonight's journey together. And never allowed to Welcome to ancient Greece. And that's where your day begins not with an alarm clock, it's the foundation, but with the sun turning your house. Feeling unwell in ancient Greece? Your home is a modest one, made of sun-dried because unless you live next door to Hippocrates himself, with small windows and no your healthcare plan includes just wooden shutters to keep out the goats and maybe some breeze and a lot of the gods are feeling generous. There's no insulation. Let's start with the basics. No ceiling fan. There are no hospitals. And certainly no such thing as personal space. If you're sick or injured, unless you count the corner where the family goat doesn't Maybe sleep. A neighbour knows a thing or two about poultices. You rise early, not because your relative remembers a prayer, because it's already too hot to stay horizontal. The god of healing. Maybe your local temple has a snake absorb heat for spiritual comfort. That's by sunrise, your little house is radiating Greek doctors were really a mix of herbalist, philosopher, and gambler. Those same they believed in the four freezer. Blood basically wrapped in a sheet, yellow bile to become a statue of frostbite. You probably slept on a thin mat. Illness was caused by an imbalance in these fluids. No pillows, just a rolled up cloak, had a fever, or maybe your arm. Too much blood. If you're lucky, time to drain it. Left you alone last night. Coughing, but probably not. Too much phlegm. There's no running water. Try fasting. So your morning routine involves either walking to the public fountain or, if you're rural, maybe take a walk or stare at the sea from a nearby well. Most carry it in clay jars balanced on your shoulders and garlic, while silently praying you might be given crushed poppy seeds. A week's worth of back Good luck with that. Ground. Boiled figs, to get or a compress made of vinegar. Don't bathe in something morning. Someone scraped off a goat for the end of the day. Did it work? You might splash your face, rub some olive oil on your skin, almost always scrape it off with a strigil. Surgery, a curved metal blade, terrifying, and generally a last resort. But without anesthesia or any real effect, even a simple cut could go septic and kill you. Your family tools included iron knives, bone saws together, prayers, eat together, lots of prayers, and argue over who tracked mud. And if you needed something amputated because the street is brought a leather strap to bite down your newsfeed, and your midwives handled childbirth, you haven't even eaten which was dangerous, and already your back hurts. You're sweating. Mortality rates for women and infants were tragically high. No tunic should. One bad birth, one stuck shoulder, the best part of your breech baby. So you've survived the sweat box of a Greek bedroom. If you were wealthy, you might summon a travelling physician. Welcome to someone with an actual scroll and some fancy oils so minimal it makes modern. If you were poor, you relied on local knowledge, street remedies, and sheer resilience. Barley bread, or you simply didn't stale, dense, and about as exciting as at least they believed in rest, clean air. It's called a balanced diet, made from ground barley mixed with water. Shaped ancient Greek medicine gave us left to bake either on hot stones, but it also gave us treatments like drink boiled cabbage water. Think ancient granola bar. Healthcare in without sweetness, texture, mostly herbs, joy, hope, and hang on. You might dunk it in watered down wine. Greece, because theatre wasn't just entertainment. The water wasn't always safe to drink. A religious ritual, no filtration system, and sometimes a full contact sport for the pitcher in your clay pantry. Let's start with the good part. Everyone. Theatre was free for elders. Assuming you weren't a woman, slave, or foreigner, not for the buzz. In which case, but for good luck seeing anything. If you're wealthy, you'd file into an enormous open-air theatre carved into a hillside, or a smudge of goat like cheese. The great theatre of Dionysus in Athens. You're not wealthy. Shoulder to shoulder with thousands of other your bread isn't crawling with yesterday's flies and doesn't crack a tooth when you bite it. Seriously, no coffee all day, no eggs. No the Dionysia festival no ran honey from dawn until unless you night, live near a decent beekeeper and know how to bribe tragedies, comedies, don't expect to sit and relax. Meals no intermission, no chairs, snacks, no fork, and certainly no bathroom mindful eating, unless you counted a bush on the hillside. You nod and you get back to work. If you showed up late or acted out, you weren't just frowned at. You don't even eat with the men. The performances in many themselves, women and children eat separately. Tragedies were emotionally gutting. Murder, so not only is madness, the food bad, war, you also get to wait destroying families because of one bad decision made 3 generations ago. Ancient Greeks are the same people who gave us symposiums, you came to weep in poetic odes to wine. Then came the comedies, but breakfast, which weren't exactly light-hearted family fare. Its utilitarian mocked politicians, philosophers, entire cities, literally burnt bodily functions with stunning precision. You chew through it like a champion. Imagine if Saturday Night Live is the only thing standing between you, then dressed it in a giant phallic costume, labor, and sent arguing philosophers. Actors wore towering masks, platform shoes, and exaggerated costumes. Now that you've choked down your stale barley brick and a splash of wine water, the chorus, it's time to freshen up, danced, or more accurately, shouted commentary, fail to. Like an ancient Greek version because of Twitter. In ancient Greece, only hygiene wasn't so much about cleanliness, and this was about ritual and oil. The audience was loud. That's a fantasy reserved for future centuries, and argued mid-performance. Your morning bath usually involves pouring cold water over your body at the public fountain or courtyard basin. You let them know. Unless you're lucky enough to live near a bathhouse, you shouted, which most people don't, and maybe re-evaluated your life. No minty body at the end of the festival, and no jury voted on which playwright from a sponge diver in the Aegean. Imagine spending 3 days crying over Orestes, olive oil, only to find out some bawdy comedy with a talking you rub it into your skin, took the prize, not to moisturize. That's ancient Greece to collect the dirt and sweat. So yes, in the theatre, you scrape it off using a strigil. You were participating, bronze blade, and possibly throwing olives, but still a little questionable. So you've survived your tragic Imagine slathering yourself in salad dressing, and now you wander into the agora. That's your bustling heart of the city. And if you think right that sounds glamorous, wearing a cloak, just remember, holding no shoes, everyone else is doing strangers, often in communal settings. Welcome to philosophy. Loud, it's everywhere. And its hygiene is social in ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, privacy is not, particularly in Athens. Now let's philosophy talk was the local sport. There are no champions were names we now associate with world-changing ideas. Maybe you rub your gums with crushed charcoal Plato, or rinse with vinegar if you're fancy. Back then, though, but mostly they were just eccentric on a twig and hope for the made other people feel stupid. Dental hygiene is more about divine mercy. The man made a career out of asking questions. Body odor led nowhere. Ubiquitous and dismantling deodorant doesn't exist in their own opinions. Perfumes do. You might be minding your own business. So you might dab a little myrrh or rose oil on your neck. And he'd appear right before walking 5 miles in sandals through the Athenian heat. I guess. The result? What is truth? A uniquely Greek blend of musk, 3 hours of mental desperation, and a desire to move to Sparta. Rare. He never wrote a wash down by beating them against stones in the river. If you're Socrates poor, left a lasting probably hasn't seen water since last Athens eventually executed him for being too annoying. Hygiene in ancient Greece officially isn't about corrupting the youth. And it's about appearing moderately less revolting than yesterday. The oil and scrape wouldn't stop asking questions during dinner. But only so much when you're sweating in a tunic. Philosophy wasn't a cozy academic hobby. So yes, it was loud, ancient Greece gave us democracy, weirdly philosophy, and architecture. Debates happened in public spaces. Shower. They were spontaneous, intense. Now that you've oil scraped your way into a new day, or deep existential crises. No spoiler alert. Just your ancient Greek wardrobe is minimal and enough ego to fill the practical at worst. And if you thought you could just watch a kite again or a hymation, philosophers loved both basically oversized linen rectangles that you wrap. You didn't walk past Plato's Academy with a belt. You were absorbed into tailored. It's not. You said one thing slightly wrong, absolutely suddenly became the day's example of unexamined life. One wrong breeze weren't safe, and suddenly your whole philosophical tutored Alexander the Great, a teenager who later conquered half of the known world. And bras. Imagine your high school civics teacher handing you a globe you're and saying, a Spartan woman trained to sprint and wrestle. You're just hoping your pins hold. Philosophy gave us logic, notices your wardrobe, ethics, shifting science, loose curtain, and political theory. Now, let's talk in ancient Greece. If you're lucky, it also gave you a leather sandals, a crisis of identity, you're barefoot, and a 70% chance a full day of walking on sun-baked stone in sandals, goat-trodden dirt. So whatever the local made it in ancient squished into the roads. You're well-spoken, clever, strolling politically active in July while dodging donkey dung. Maybe that's your daily commute. That's your first mistake. Of course, there's no sun protection. Because in Athens, no hats being unless you're a farmer could get you kicked out of the city no for sunscreen 10 years because you live in not 450 BCE, not fined, and science hasn't been invented yet. This wasn't a conspiracy or a backroom deal. It doesn't care how philosophical it was built into the system. It will roast you. It was called ostracism. By noon, your shoulders are perfectly legal, your feet are filthy, perfectly public, and your linen robe perfectly stuck to you in 4 places that defy geometry. A year, the citizens of Athens would gather to decide whether to hold an ostracism isn't shocking in Greek society. If enough people agreed, everyone wrote the name of a person they wanted exiled on a broken piece of pottery called delivering speeches in togas. If someone got 6,000 or more votes, they were banished. If you're wealthy, no trial. Your tunic might be dyed, just maybe a soft pack your sandals and saffron yellow. You didn't have to be a criminal. Wear off-white or brown. Most ostracized people had done nothing wrong, and no one wants to waste good colour on the guy who fixes maybe you were a war hero, a persuasive speaker, so you walk through your day dressed like a toga burrito. Whatever it was, your fellow citizens decided you were becoming a threat to democracy loose in front of the priestess. And democracy voted to yeet you into temporary oblivion. You're only halfway through your chores. And here's the twist. It wasn't permanent. Welcome to ancient Ostracism Greece, lasted 10 years. Military service isn't a job. Which you could come back like your civic duty, your property was untouched, and sometimes your one-way ticket to an early grave. Just if you're a decade-long vacation you didn't ask for, especially in Athens or Sparta. Some famous Athenians were ostracized. Aristides the just was so well liked that someone allegedly voted against him just because they were already training how virtuous he was, and learning formations in the phalanx. Even Themistocles, that famous Greek military genius who saved Athens involved standing shoulder to shoulder behind large shields and hoping the guy next to you doesn't trip. Turns out, gratitude has an expiration date. Boys start military training at age 7 to protect Athens from tyrant system, but it often a program that turns children into warriors. So if you were ambitious, essentially you had to walk a fine line, whipping and isolating them until only the toughest remained. In Athens, but not things are charismatic enough to worry still people. Mandatory. 2 years of training like a reality show where the prize for winning by decades of fans is being exiled to the countryside with your dignity. You don't get to say, and I'm more of a thinker. Even philosophers Athens like Socrates to democracy wars, and not with it also invented cancel culture with actual 2,500 years always a schedule. Whether it's Sparta versus Athens, you didn't ask if you were going to die young. Sparta you just wondered literally everyone and how painfully. Or just a neighbouring polis getting sassy life about trade routes hovered around 30 to 35 is a way of life. And that was if you made it just the pause between two invasions. Which was no small feat. Armour? Roughly 1 in 3 children did get a bronze helmet, breastplate, thanks to disease, poor round nutrition shield, and the fact that hygiene was, if you can't, as we've discussed, well, more theoretical, try not to be in the front row. You could die from anything. Don't stop arrows. A scratch that turned to worst part. A fever. You supply your own gear. That's right. Being a leading cause of death for women situation, or something as simple as drinking your own wrong cup of water. Poorer citizens medicine was limited, borrow, and divine intervention wasn't known for consistency. Which is Greek for more likely to die. If you lived in a city, and when you're not fighting, spread fast, preparing, cramped quarters, open-air sewers, and communal fountains in the assembly about made epidemics a regular or rowing warships for hours as part of the infamous plague of Athens. Because yes, the Peloponnesian War wiped out a third of the city. There's no veterans' Thucydides wrote about it. No pensions, no therapy. Then he got it. Just scars. Then somehow. And the occasional poorly carved gravestone praising your virtue and courage. War? If you think life as a man in ancient Greece sounds rough, odds were you'd die holding a spear or rowing a trireme. Even if you weren't killed in battle, injuries often turned fatal days later. Women had fewer rights than a pile of decorative urns. No stitches. You couldn't vote, just couldn't hold office, garlic, couldn't own land outright, and there was always the possibility of death by divine tantrum. In fact, if people saw you out too displease often, a god, they might start whispering that you were a courtesan or mock a temple statue or speak ill of Zeus after 3 cups with your daily routine. And you could find yourself on the wrong end of a lightning bolt, plague, you spin wool, or spontaneous goat stampede, grind grain. Burial rites were important. Bake bread. Manage your family couldn't afford a proper funeral has any, with coins for the ferryman and rituals to secure your spot in the afterlife. But one without dumped pay, outside the city walls, or days unmarked and forgotten. Your social life. Not only was that tragic, you don't attend plays. Dangerous. You don't join the philosophical debates. Unburied You're not souls at the gymnasium eternally. That's for naked men caught between worlds. You're confined mostly to death. The wasn't poetic. The women's quarters. It was daily, and your contact with the outside about your philosophy, of glimpses your beauty, lattice work, or your lineage. Education. You could be a slave, a general, lucky, or a poet. You might learn to read a bit and still die from a mouldy fig. You're trained in domestic duties. Philosophy. The Greeks had 12 Olympians. Geometry, and not a single one of them. That's for the boys. Your job is to marry well, ancient Greek sons, and stay invisible while doing divine. Marriage happens young. Hera, often in your early teens. Apollo, to a man twice your age. Poseidon, arranged by your father, the Golden Crew, who treats you more like a trade agreement than in practice. It was love is optional. Spiritual damage. Dowries are mandatory. And when you do have children, peaceful, your primary value becomes your womb. They were divine drama queens with superpowers. Sparta was the exception. Forget a sacrifice. Spartan women ruin your crops, famously more liberated. Say the wrong prayer. They were educated. Your ships sink. Exercised in public. Step into the wrong property. Before you envy them too much, remember, their freedom came from a state-sponsored obsession. The gods didn't just demand your loyalty. Eugenics. They demanded perfect your main job as a Spartan flawless woman, rituals, give birth to strong warriors, or face disgrace. You didn't have weekly temple visits. And if your husband dies, you had daily rituals, you can't inherit home altars, you can't remarry without permission, and civic ceremonies. Your options shrink faster than your social circles. You're stuck. Pray to Demeter, socially, go to war, and often physically. Offer to Ares. So yes, traveling by sea, the Greeks worshipped powerful goddesses. You better pour out some wine to Poseidon, Artemis, and maybe throw in a goat just to be safe. Real women. Each god had expected to stay quiet. Stay home. Apollo might protect your city, sight, unless your grandfather offended him once, hailed as the birthplace of democracy until further notice. And yes, technically that's true. Hera was the goddess of marriage. Before you get too excited, she also specialized in making mortal women's probably lives wouldn't qualify to participate Zeus so much as looked at them. In fact, the majority of people living in Athens were completely excluded from the democratic process. Casual. To vote in the Olympians weren't enough to keep you nervous. You had to be nymphs. Male-born spirits, to Athenian parents, river gods and monsters lurking around every corner. Over 18, step on the wrong patch that of sacred land. Women and suddenly your left leg belongs to a vengeful slaves and children who made up nearly 90% of the population. You never knew why had no political voice whatsoever. Was it the wrong not democracy for the wrong timing? That's democracy. Did you insult a very specific club of sunburned men? Maybe it was your cousin. Maybe it was something your great-grandfather did. You didn't just vote. Doesn't matter. The gods work in mysterious and constantly personal ways. Laws were proposed, for all the debated, and Greek religion was woven to every part of life. From politics there were to childbirth to the Olympic Games. Every eligible man was part legislator, part jury member, but you also depended on overconfident amateur. Their temples were city randomly chosen. Their festivals were national holidays, like running the treasury explained everything from lightning to love through a lottery system. You didn't believe in gods out of faith, thrilling until you remembered there were no survival instincts. So your fishmonger might oversee military logistics one day. The barley bread breakfast, who still believes in sea-blistered treks, might judge a murder trial tomorrow. Plagues, and if someone got too powerful, and goat-related traumas, or just annoyed people the wrong way. Question plainly: ostracism. Would you last a single day? Once a year, ancient Greece, citizens could write a name on a broken piece of pottery. An ostracon before lunch, and vote to exile that person for 10 years. The constant threat of war or divine punishment would wipe that Instagrammable toga fantasy right off your face. You're not used to hauling water before breakfast. Athenian democracy was revolutionary next to a temple goat. It gave ordinary men a voice. You'd miss your running water, some your ordinary men, and your right to complain without being exiled by pottery shard. But make no mistake, you might love the idea of living among marble statues, and it wasn't brilliant philosophers and epic poets. You were a woman, but guess what? Silenced. Those were the one-born resident who paid taxes. For everyone else, it was backbreaking building the Parthenon, limited rights, and definitely funerals. Your philosopher who asked too many questions. Only if you're a male citizen, possibly executed. Your medicine, garlic, democracy was born in ancient Greece, frequently furious. But if you'd shown up expecting your social rights and inclusive politics, the guy yelling in the agora about justice escorted out of the assembly, and yet told to bring your own all of that, the Greeks endured. In ancient Greece, they built slavery wasn't just accepted. Wrote plays we still perform, even modest ideas we still wrestled with, slave, and laid the groundwork. Not because the family was wealthy, but because slavery was so deeply woven into society that it felt as normal as civilization while sweating through it. The idea that someone might not own another human being, practically not because life was easy. Slaves weren't because they found ways to make meaning in a world full of chaos. They came from conquered lands. They questioned everything. Scythians fought constantly, and even fellow Greeks from the wrong city-state died young time. And still, some were born into slavery, shaped the modern others were prisoners of war. So no, if you were kidnapped and sold, probably wouldn't make it past your first thriving, brutal market, goat bite, and business was always good. Philosophy lesson in the street. If you lived in Athens, but if your slave likely did everything. If you adapted, cooked your meals, endured, and fetched your water, cleaned your home, you'd find yourself standing among some of the most passionate, your shopping, resilient, and stood brilliantly flawed people history has ever known. Some even handled business. They wouldn't judge you for struggle or manage the household. They just hand you a tunic, owner lounge point to the amphory and say, "Good. Now carry that up a hill." It began with a death and a betrayal. Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe in what is now Eastern England, Prasutagus had played the Roman Iceni tribe in what is now Eastern England. He had walked a tightrope for years, played the Roman game as a client king under the shadow of Rome. For years, he had ruling as a client king under the shadow of Rome, so long as he stayed useful to the empire. Autonomy and peace. But when he died around 60 AD, he left behind a will that was meant to protect around 60 AD. He left behind the Roman emperor that was meant to protect his people, alongside his two young daughters. He named the Roman emperor, hoping this gesture of loyalty would secure their safety and sovereignty. Hoping this gesture of loyalty would secure their safety and sovereignty. Rome did not honour the will. Rome didn't negotiate. Rome did not honour the will. Rome didn't negotiate. The Roman authorities annexed the Iceni kingdom outright. The Roman authorities stormed in and claimed everything outright. Lands, their soldiers stormed in and claimed everything. Land, but the theft of wealth wasn't the worst offense and treasures. It was what they did next of wealth that turned a political insult into a personal hell. It was what they did next that turned a political insult into a personal hell. Public. They not just to humiliate her, Boudica, but to send a message. Not just to humiliate her, and if that wasn't enough, they violated her daughters in front of her. And if that wasn't enough, this wasn't just they violated her daughters in front of her. It was psychological warfare. This wasn't just the kind meant to break a people's spirit. It was psychological warfare. But it didn't break the kind meant to break a people's spirit. Rome believed it had crushed a minor tribal woman beneath its boot. Rome believed it had crushed a minor tribal woman beneath its boot. A lioness. What it had done who would take her pain was awaken, shape it into vengeance. A queen who
a mother
would take
whose
her pain
rage
and
would soon
reshape
set
its
cities
into
ablaze.
vengeance.
A mother
woman
whose
who would
rage
remind
would
Rome
soon
that
set
even
cities
empires
ablaze.
bleed. A woman
Word
who would
of the
remind
atrocity
Rome
spread
that even
quickly through
empires
Britannia.
bleed. Other
Word of
tribes
the
listened.
atrocity spread quickly
They
through
remembered their
Britannia.
own humiliations.
Other tribes listened.
Their own land losses.
They remembered their own
sons
humiliations.
killed in Roman campaigns.
Their own land losses.
Rome
Their own
thought the
sons
tribes
killed
divided,
in Roman campaigns.
scattered. Rome thought
But
the
in that
tribes
moment,
divided. They had one thing in
scattered.
common. But in that
Boudicca's
moment,
fury.
they had one thing in
What
common.
began with Rome violating one
Boudicca's
queen
fury
would soon end with the empire
What
reeling
began
in
with
fear.
Rome violating one
They
queen
had broken
would
a
soon end
treaty,
with the empire
broken
reeling
a
in
family.
fear.
And in
They
doing
had
so,
broken a treaty,
broken the illusion
broken a
of
family.
Roman invincibility.
And in doing so,
broken the illusion
this wasn't
of Roman
just a mistake.
invincibility in Britannia.
It was the spark that would ignite one
This
of the
wasn't
most
just a
ferocious
mistake.
revolts Rome
It
ever
was the
faced.
spark that would ignite one of the most
If Rome
ferocious
expected
revolts
Boudica
Rome
to fade
ever
into
faced.
silence, they misunderstood
If Rome
everything about
expected
her.
Boudica to fade into
Boudica
silence,
wasn't
they
born
misunderstood
to obey.
everything about
She
her.
was born to
Boudica
lead.
wasn't born to obey. Described by
She was
Roman
born
historians
to lead.
who rarely complimented their enemies.
Described by
as
Roman
tall,
historians
fierce,
who
with
rarely
flaming
complimented
red
their
hair
enemies,
cascading down
as
to her
tall,
waist,
fierce,
and a voice
with
that
flaming
sliced
red
through
hair
crowds
cascading
like a
down
war
to
horn.
her waist,
She
and a
wasn't
voice
just a
that
queen
sliced
by
through
blood.
crowds like a war
She was a
horn.
symbol. She wasn't just a
And
queen
now,
by blood. She was a
she
threat.
was a symbol.
But before she
now,
became that threat, she was a
she
threat.
became something deeper.
But before she
A
became
mother
that threat,
with nothing
she
left
became
to
something
lose.
deeper.
A
Roman
mother
brutality
with
had tried to
nothing
erase
left to
her
lose.
dignity. Her children's
Roman
future
brutality
and
had
her
tried to
people's
erase her
pride.
dignity.
But
Her
Boudica
children's
refused to
future
be a victim.
and her people's pride.
She understood what
But
Rome
Boudica
feared
refused
most
to be a
wasn't
victim.
an army.
It was
She
unity.
understood what Rome feared most,
And so
wasn't
she
an
began
army.
to forge it.
It was unity,
One tribe at a time.
and so she began to
First,
forge it. The
one tribe
Trinovantes
at a time.
They had once been
First,
powerful before
the
Rome crushed
Trinovantes.
them under taxes.
Land
They had once been
sieges,
powerful before
slave
Rome
labour.
crushed them under taxes. When
Land
Boudica
sieges,
spoke, she
and
didn't
slave
speak
labour.
like a diplomat. She
When
spoke
Boudica
like a
spoke,
warrior mother.
she didn't speak
scarred
like a
but
diplomat.
unbroken. She spoke like a
She
warrior
reminded
mother
them of their
scarred
ancestors,
but unbroken,
of their gods,
She
and of the
reminded
earth they
them
no
of their
longer owned.
ancestors. Her
of their
pain
gods,
was their pain,
and of the earth
her
they no
rage,
longer owned.
theirs too.
Her pain was their
Then
pain.
the other tribes began
Her rage,
to listen.
theirs
The
too.
Corieltauvi. Then the other
Cornovi,
tribes began to listen.
even some of the Brigantes.
The Corieltauvi. Her
The
cause was
Cornovi,
no longer about
even
vengeance.
some of the Brigantes.
It became a holy
Her
mission.
cause was no longer
to cleanse
about
Britannia
vengeance.
of Roman
It
arrogance.
became a holy mission.
She didn't promise
to cleanse
safety.
Britannia of
She
Roman
promised
arrogance.
glory.
And
She
death
didn't
with
promise
honour,
safety.
if it came to that.
She promised glory.
And they followed her.
And death with
Because she
honour,
did not
if it came
stand
to
behind
that.
her warriors,
And they followed
she
her.
rode among them
Because she
spear
did not
in
stand
hand,
behind her
hair
warriors
loose
to the wind.
She rode among
Eyes
them,
locked on the
spear in
future.
hand, hair
She
loose
called
to the
out the
wind,
names of the raped,
eyes
the
locked on the
enslaved,
future,
the executed.
She called out the names
She
of the
summoned
raped,
gods like
the enslaved,
Andraste,
the
Celtic
executed.
war goddess.
She
as her
summoned
witness.
gods like Andraste,
And her warriors
the Celtic
believed
war
her when she
goddess,
said the
as her
gods would
witness.
fight with them. And her
She had
warriors
no
believed
formal
her when she
military
said the
training.
gods would fight with
No
them.
Roman strategy
She had no
scrolls,
formal military
but she
training.
had something
no
deadlier.
Roman strategy
Righteous
scrolls.
fury,
But she
sharpened
had something
by
betrayal.
betrayal. Righteous
Guided
fury,
by purpose.
sharpened by
And
betrayal.
the land itself seemed to
guided
shift
by
under her
purpose.
command.
And
This
the
wasn't
land
rebellion.
itself seemed to shift
It was
under her
resurrection.
command.
This
The
wasn't
Queen
rebellion.
Rome
Thought it had broken.
It was resurrection.
Was now the spearhead of a movement.
The Queen
that would
Rome
soon make
thought
the
it had
empire
broken.
tremble. Was now the spearhead
And she
of a
was just
movement that
getting
would
started.
soon make the empire
The
tremble.
Roman eagle had long
And she was
soared
just
over
getting
Britannia.
started. But now
The Roman
the winds
eagle had
beneath
long
its wings
soared
were
over
changing.
Britannia.
But
Boudica's
now,
fury
the
wasn't
winds
a
beneath its
wildfire.
wings were
It
changing.
was a storm building with
Boudica's
terrifying
fury wasn't a
purpose.
wildfire,
And
it was
storms
a
need
storm
fuel.
building with terrifying
That
purpose.
fuel came from the thousands of
storms
Britons
need
who had
fuel.
waited years.
That fuel
Generations
came
even,
from the
for
thousands
someone
of
to defy
Britons
the
who had
empire.
waited years.
Someone
Someone
to
to
speak
speak
not in Latin,
someone
but
to
in
defy
blood
the
and iron.
empire. She
Someone
gave
to
them
speak
that
not in
voice.
Latin, but in blood and iron.
It started with war councils
She gave them
held
that
under
voice.
sacred groves and moonlit hills.
It started with war councils held
Boudica
under
didn't
sacred
sit on a
groves
throne.
and moonlit hills.
She stood in the dirt with her
Boudica
people.
didn't sit on a throne.
She listened to the anger
She
of
stood in the
tribal
dirt
elders,
with her people.
to the sorrow of mothers.
She listened to the
and
anger
to the
of tribal
chants of
elders,
druids who saw
to the
omens
sorrow
in the
of
sky,
mothers,
and to the chants of
They
druids
all spoke
who saw
of one
omens
truth.
in the sky.
Rome had pushed too far.
They all spoke of one
Now
truth. It was time to push
Rome
back.
had pushed too far.
Warriors from the
Now
Trinovantes
it was
brought
time to
spears,
push back.
slings, and ancient
Warriors
battle
from the
chants.
Trinovantes brought
The
spears,
Iceni added
slings,
cavalry,
and ancient battle
swift
chants.
riders with wild hair
The
and
Mycenae added cavalry, fierce and fearless. Swift riders with wild
Other tribes
hair and
joined
war-paint,
with axes,
fierce
blades,
and
and
fearless.
torches.
Other tribes
Even women
joined
took
with
up arms,
axes, blades,
inspired
and
by
torches.
their queen.
Even
This
women
wasn't just
took
an
up
army
arms,
forming,
inspired
it was
by
a
their
resurrection
queen.
of Celtic
This
identity.
wasn't just an army forming,
But Rome
it
had
was a
trained
resurrection
legions,
of Celtic identity.
professional soldiers,
But Rome had
armoured,
trained legions,
disciplined,
professional
and lethal.
soldiers. Boudica
Armoured,
had to make up for that
disciplined,
with numbers,
and lethal.
knowledge of the land, Boudica had to make up for that with numbers, knowledge of the
hatred
land,
forged in
and something
humiliation.
Rome could never teach. Soon,
Hatred forged
Boudica's
in
army
humiliation.
swelled to tens of thousands. Soon,
Farmers became
Boudica's
warriors,
army swelled to
hunters
tens
became
of
assassins.
thousands.
Former
Farmers
Roman
became
slaves
warriors
and mistreated
hunters
tribal
became
allies
assassins.
switched sides.
Former Roman slaves
These weren't
and
soldiers
mistreated
who
tribal
fought for
allies
pay.
switched sides. They fought for memory.
These weren't soldiers
revenge,
who fought for pay.
and the right to raise
They
children
fought for
without
memory.
chains. Revenge. She gave
the
the
right
right
to
to
raise
raise children without
the first
chains.
of many.
Roman
She gave a
historians
speech,
would later record
the
her
first of
words,
many,
albeit with
Roman
their bias.
historians would later record
But
her
what
words,
echoes through time
albeit
is clear.
with their bias.
She vowed to win
But
or
what
die.
echoes through time is clear.
There would be no surrender.
She vowed to
no
win
submission
or die.
No turning back.
There would be no surrender.
Then came the
submission.
first target. No turning back.
Camulodunum. Once
Then
a
came the
British
first
stronghold.
target. Now a
Camulodunum.
Roman colony littered with
Once a
temples,
British stronghold.
statues. Now
And
a
villas.
Roman colony littered with
The
temples,
temple of Claudius
statues,
stood as an
and
insult.
villas. A shrine to
The
the,
temple
emperor
of Claudius
who had conquered
stood
them.
as an insult.
To
A
Boudica
shrine
and her
to the
warriors,
emperor
who
it
it was
was
not
conquered them.
sacred. It was
To
a
Boudica and
provocation.
her warriors, it was
And it
not
would be
sacred.
the first to fall.
It was a provocation.
The tribes were no longer
And it would be
whispering
the first
rebellion.
to fall.
They were marching
The
toward
tribes
it,
were no
armed
longer
with
whispering
fury,
rebellion.
and led by
They
a
were
queen
marching
who
toward
refused
it,
to kneel,
armed with fury,
and
and
led by a
Camulodunum
queen
never
who
stood a
refused
chance.
to kneel. The once proud Roman colony
Camulodunum
had become
never
a
stood a
symbol of
chance.
everything Boudica's
The
people
once proud
despised.
Roman colony had become a
Its
symbol
streets
of everything
echoed not
Boudica's
with tribal
people
chants,
despised.
but with Latin commands.
Its streets echoed not
Its
with
buildings
tribal
rose
chants,
atop
but with
sacred
Latin
ground,
commands.
and towering
Its
over
buildings
it all was
rose
the temple
atop
of sacred
Claudius,
ground,
a
and
marble
towering over
mockery
it all
built
was
with
the
forced
temple of
labour,
Claudius, praising the
a
emperor
marble
who
mockery
had
built
subjugated
with
the
forced
Britons,
labour.
praising the
To
emperor
Rome,
who had
it was a
subjugated
monument.
the Britons. To Boudica,
To Rome,
it was a target.
it was a monument.
She gave the
To
order.
Boudica,
It was a target.
what followed wasn't a siege.
She gave the order.
It was an execution.
What followed?
Her
wasn't
army
a siege.
descended like a tidal
It was an
wave.
execution.
Roman settlers,
Her army
many
descended
of them
like a
veterans
tidal
who had
wave.
bullied and taxed the local
Roman
tribes.
settlers,
Many
were
of them
caught off
veterans
guard.
who had bullied and
The city
taxed
had
the
no
local
proper
tribes
walls.
were
A
caught
few
off guard.
Roman soldiers
The
stationed
city
there
had
were
no
poorly
proper
prepared.
walls. A few
Expecting
Roman
peace,
soldiers stationed
not
there
war.
were poorly prepared.
They tried to hold the
expecting
temple,
peace,
barricading
not war.
themselves inside.
They tried to
Believing
hold
it
the
could
temple,
endure a siege, barricading themselves
It didn't.
inside. Believing it
Within
could
2
endure
days,
a siege,
Boudica's forces
it didn't.
breached it. The
Within
streets
2
ran
days,
red.
Boudica's
They
forces
spared
breached
no one.
it.
The streets
Men,
ran red.
women, and
They
children
spared
were
no one.
slaughtered. Men,
Boudica's
women,
war
and children
wasn't just
were
military.
slaughtered.
It was personal.
Boudica's
Her
war
warriors
wasn't just
destroyed
military.
Roman statues.
It was personal.
Burned villas. Her
and
warriors
turned their
destroyed
rage onto
Roman
the very
statues,
symbols of occupation.
burned villas,
and
The
turned
temple
their
was
rage
set
onto the
ablaze,
very symbols of
its
occupation.
roof collapsing in a firestorm
The temple
that
was
lit
set
the sky
ablaze,
for miles.
its roof collapsing
Survivors
in a
were rare,
firestorm that lit the sky
and those
for
who did
miles.
escape carried tales
Survivors
of horror
were
that
rare,
chilled Roman
and
blood.
those who did escape carried
fury
tales
wasn't
of horror
random.
that chilled Roman
It was
blood.
deliberate.
The
These
fury
were
wasn't
people who
random.
had seen their homes
It was
taken,
deliberate.
their gods mocked.
These were people
their
who had
daughters
seen their
sold.
homes taken.
Now
Now they were
gods
reclaiming
mocked.
what had been
Their
stolen
daughters sold.
with interest. Now they were
Roman
reclaiming
officials
what had been
sent
stolen
pleas for help to
with
Governor
interest.
Suetonius.
Roman
was
officials
hundreds of
sent
miles
pleas
away
for
in
help
Wales,
to Governor
suppressing
Suetonius,
another rebellion,
who was hundreds of miles
But by
away
the time
in
he
Wales,
heard of
suppressing
Camulodunum's
another
fall,
rebellion.
it was already ash
But by the
and
time he
smoke.
heard of Camulodunum's
The colony
fall,
destroyed,
it was already
its
ash
citizens
and
dead,
smoke,
and the flame
colony
of rebellion
destroyed,
rising higher,
its citizens dead.
and the
Boudica
flame
didn't
of
stay to
rebellion
celebrate.
rising higher.
There was no time. Boudica didn't
She
stay
knew
to
Rome
celebrate.
would respond.
There was no
and
time.
hard.
So
She knew
she
Rome
pressed
would
on,
respond,
knowing that
and
each
hard.
victory brought her
So
momentum. She pressed on.
Her next
Knowing that each
destination was
victory
a city
brought her
larger,
momentum.
richer, and
Her
even
next
more
destination
vulnerable.
was a city larger,
Londinium.
richer, and even
If
more
Rome
vulnerable.
hadn't taken her seriously before,
Londinium, they would now. If Rome hadn't taken her
Camulodunum
seriously
was the
before,
beginning.
they would now.
But it wasn't revenge yet.
Camulodunum was
Not
the
until
beginning.
the empire's beating
But it
heart
wasn't
in Britannia
revenge yet.
felt the fire.
Not until the empire's
Londinium was the
beating
jewel
heart
of
in
Roman
Britannia felt
Britannia.
the fire. Founded just
Londinium
17
was the
years
jewel
earlier
of Roman
It
Britannia.
had grown into a thriving
Founded
hub
just
of trade
17
and
years earlier.
administration. It had grown into a
Merchants from
thriving
across the
hub of
empire
trade
filled
and
its
administration.
markets.
Officials
Merchants from
conducted
across the
imperial
empire
business
filled
under
its
tiled
markets.
roofs. Officials
Wealth
conducted
flowed through
imperial
its streets
business
like
under
water.
tiled roofs. But as Boudica's
Wealth
army
flowed
marched
through its
ever
streets
closer,
like water.
that wealth turned into
But as
panic.
Boudica's army marched ever
Governor
closer,
Suetonius,
that wealth
having
turned
rushed
into
back
panic.
from Wales with a small force,
Governor Suetonius
arrived just ahead of
having
the
rushed
rebellion.
back from Wales with a
He
small
looked at
force.
Londinium Laminium, arrived just ahead of the rebellion, defenseless. He looked at Londinium, and made a brutal decision, sprawling. He abandoned defenseless, and made a Roman legion stationed elsewhere were too far to help. The Roman legions stationed elsewhere were too far to help. Couldn't be defended. Suetonius couldn't risk his limited troops in a city that taking with him those who could flee. So He withdrew.
He left behind the
taking
old,
with him those who
sick,
could flee,
the stubborn.
He left behind
those
the
too
old,
slow to believe
sick,
a woman-led army could bring down Rome.
And those too slow
They
to
would learn
believe a
otherwise.
woman-led army could bring down
Boudicca's forces
Rome.
swept into Londinium
They would learn
like a
otherwise.
thunderclap.
There were no
Boudicca's
walls
forces
to
swept
scale,
into
no
Londinium
gates
like a
to
thunderclap.
breach. The city
There were no
was
walls
open
to
and she
scale,
made it bleed.
no gates to breach.
Her warriors
The
tore
city was
through
open
streets
and
with
she
the
made it
rage of
bleed.
generations. Her
They
warriors
didn't
tore
loot,
through
they
streets
didn't
with the
occupy,
rage of generations.
They eradicated,
They didn't
the killing
loot,
was
They
systematic.
didn't occupy.
Roman
They
citizens
eradicated.
were dragged from their
The
homes.
killing was systematic.
Entire families
Roman
were butchered.
citizens were dragged
Some
from
were
their homes.
impaled. Others
Entire
burned alive
families
in
were
temples.
butchered.
Some
No
were
quarter
impaled.
was given.
Others burned
No
alive in
Roman
temples.
symbol was spared. No quarter was given.
Villas were torched.
And no Roman
warehouses
symbol was spared.
exploded into flame.
Villas were torched.
The rising smoke
warehouses
could be seen from
exploded
miles
into
away,
flame.
curling black
The
against
rising
the British
smoke could be
sky.
seen from miles away.
This wasn't just a
curling
slaughter.
black against the
It was a
British sky.
statement. This
The
wasn't
message,
just a slaughter.
Rome is
It was a
not
statement.
invincible. The message,
Contemporary Roman
Rome
sources,
is not invincible.
like Tacitus and Cassius Dio,
Contemporary Roman
estimated
sources,
that tens of
like
thousands
Tacitus
died.
and Cassius Dio,
Some accounts
estimated
say the
that tens
brutality
of thousands
exceeded even
died.
what occurred at Camulodunum.
Some accounts say the brutality
To
exceeded
Roman minds,
even what occurred
this was
at
not just a
Camulodunum.
rebellion.
It was
To
apocalypse.
Roman minds, this was not
And
just a
through it all,
rebellion.
rode
It was
Boudica.
apocalypse. She did not
And
hide
through it
behind
all,
commanders.
rode Boudica.
She led. She did
On
not
chariot,
hide behind
flanked
commanders.
by her daughters.
She led.
She watched as the empire's
chariot,
pride crumbled
flanked
beneath
by her
her.
daughters.
She
This
watched
wasn't
as the
senseless
empire's
violence.
pride crumbled beneath
To her, it was justice
This
for
wasn't
what Rome
senseless
had done.
violence. To
To
her
her,
family, it was
her
justice
people,
for what
her
Rome
land.
had done. And she
To her
wasn't
family,
finished. Her people,
because
her
ahead of
land.
her stood another Roman
She
centre.
wasn't finished.
Verulamium,
Because ahead of her stood
And
another
beyond
Roman
that,
centre, Rome's full
Verulamium.
retaliation. And beyond
Rome
that,
had faced rebellions
Rome's
before.
full retaliation.
It had fought wars across
Rome
continents.
had faced rebellions before,
but never had it seen
It
anything
had fought
quite
wars
like
across
Boudica.
continents.
She wasn't
But
a
never had
general
it seen
trained
anything
in
quite
tactics.
like Boudica. She didn't speak
She
Latin.
wasn't a general trained
She didn't
in
wear
tactics.
polished armour.
She didn't speak
Yet
Latin.
she had burned two
She
Roman
didn't wear
cities to the
polished
ground
armour.
and butchered thousands.
Yet she had burned
citizens
two Roman
and
cities to
soldiers
the
alike
ground and butchered thousands.
And now, as
Citizens
Verulamium,
and soldiers
a
alike,
prosperous Romanized
and
town
now,
northwest
as
of
Verulamium,
went
a
up in
prosperous
flames,
Romanized town
the empire
northwest
began
of
to
Londinium,
panic.
went
Word
up in
of her
flames.
rampage had reached
The
the Roman
empire
Senate.
began to panic.
Emperor Nero
Word of her
himself
rampage had
reportedly
reached the
considered
Roman
withdrawing
Senate.
entirely from Britannia.
Emperor Nero himself
Imagine
reportedly
that.
considered withdrawing
An empire
entirely
that
from
spanned
Britannia.
from the deserts of Africa to the
Imagine
mountains
that.
of Germania.
An empire
considering
that spanned
retreat
from the
because
deserts
of
of
one
Africa
woman
to
with
the
a
mountains
chariot
of
and a
Germania,
cause.
considering retreat.
That's how
because
much
of one
she
woman with a
terrified them.
chariot and a cause. In truth,
That's
Boudica's
how much
power
she
wasn't just in
terrified
her
them.
army. In truth,
It was in what she
Boudica's power
represented.
wasn't just in her army.
Rome saw itself as
It was in
unshakable.
what she represented.
Its cities as eternal.
Rome saw
Its
itself
rule
as unshakable.
as destiny. Its cities as eternal.
But here was a Celtic
Its rule
queen,
as destiny.
once beaten and humiliated.
But here was a
now
Celtic
leading
queen,
a revolt that
once
had reduced
beaten and
entire Roman
humiliated.
settlements
Now
to ash.
leading a revolt that had
Every new
reduced
city she
entire
burned
Roman settlements
wasn't just
to
a
ash.
tactical victory.
Every new
It was a
city she
psychological
burned
blow.
wasn't just a tactical victory.
Verulamium followed
It
the
was a
same fate as
psychological blow.
Camulodunum and Londinium.
Verulamium followed the
It was
same
rich,
fate as Camulodunum
Romanized,
and
and
Londinium.
completely unfortified.
It was rich.
Boudica's
Romanized,
warriors slaughtered the
completely
inhabitants,
unfortified.
destroyed temples and leveled
Boudica's
Roman
warriors
infrastructure.
slaughtered the inhabitants,
Destroyed
archaeological
temples
evidence
and
today
leveled Roman
still shows
infrastructure.
a thick layer of ash
Archaeological
beneath the modern
evidence
town.
today
A
still
fire
shows
that
a
raged
thick
with
layer
such
of ash
intensity
beneath the modern town.
It left a scar
A
in the
fire
earth.
that raged with
But
such
here was the
intensity.
paradox.
It left
With
a
each
scar
victory,
in the earth.
Boudica's war
But
machine
here was the
grew
paradox.
heavier.
With each
Her army
victory,
swelled,
Boudica's war
but supply
machine grew
lines
heavier.
thinned.
Her army
Organization
swelled,
faltered.
but supply lines
Drunk
thinned.
with success,
Some
organization
tribes grew
careless.
careless.
Drunk
And
with
Rome,
success,
known for
some
its resilience,
tribes
grew careless.
was regrouping.
And Rome,
Governor
known for its
Suetonius
resilience,
wasn't
was
idle.
regrouping. He had retreated.
Governor
Yes,
Suetonius wasn't
but
idle.
not surrendered.
He had retreated.
He began gathering
Yes,
reinforcements,
but not
pulling
surrendered.
battle-hardened legions
He began
from across
gathering
the province.
reinforcements,
Pulling
sought the high
battle-hardened
ground,
legions from
studied
across
the terrain,
province,
and prepared for
He
one
sought the high
decisive
ground,
battle.
studied the terrain,
Still,
and
even
prepared
with
for
Roman
one
strength
decisive
rebuilding,
battle. There was one
Still,
lingering fear in
even
every
with Roman
soldier's
strength
heart.
rebuilding,
There was
could they
one
stop her?
lingering fear in every soldier's
Because
heart.
Boudica wasn't just waging
Could they
war.
stop her?
She was rewriting the
Because
story
Boudica
of
wasn't
conquest.
just waging war,
And she was proving,
she was rewriting
city
the
after
story
burning
of conquest,
city,
that
and
Rome
she was
could
proving,
bleed, and
city
queens
after
could
burning
strike back,
city,
that Rome
the final
could bleed,
confrontation was
and
coming,
queens could strike
and
back.
the empire held its
The
breath.
final confrontation
confrontation
The
was
fire
coming,
had spread as far
and
as
the
it
empire
could.
held its breath.
Now,
the storm
the
had
fire
to
had
face
spread
steel.
as far as it
Governor
could.
Gaius Suetonius
Now,
Paulinus,
the storm
had
had
chosen
to
his
face steel.
battlefield carefully.
Governor Gaius Suetonius
He wasn't
Paulinus
just any
had
Roman
chosen his
officer.
battlefield carefully.
He was a survivor. He wasn't just any Roman
While
officer.
Boudicca's warriors
He was a
celebrated their
survivor.
victories,
Suetonius was
While
calculating.
Boudicca's warriors celebrated their victories,
a narrow defile.
Suetonius was calculating.
Tight space bordered by
He
forest and
selected a
hills,
narrow defile,
where Boudicca's numerical advantage
bordered
by
by
forest
forest
and hills, where
His
Boudicca's
army was
numerical
small,
advantage
maybe
would count for
10,000
little.
strong,
But every man
his army
was
was
a trained
small,
killer,
maybe
forged
10,000
in the
strong,
discipline of the legions.
but every man was a trained killer.
Boudicca's force,
Forged
on
in
the
the
other
discipline
hand, was
of the
immense.
legions.
Some sources
Boudicca's
claim up to
force, on the other
200,000
hand, was
warriors
immense.
marched under her banner.
Some sources claim up
but
to
they weren't
200,000
soldiers.
warriors
They were
marched under her
farmers,
banner.
blacksmiths,
But they weren't
tribal
soldiers.
chiefs. They were
and
farmers,
freedom seekers,
blacksmiths,
inspired,
tribal chiefs,
but undisciplined,
and freedom seekers,
armed with fury,
inspired,
but not
but
formation.
undisciplined. They believed
Armed with
numbers
fury,
would crush Rome
but not
like a
formation.
tide.
They
They
were
believed
wrong.
numbers would crush Rome like
As
a tide.
Boudicca's army approached,
They were
she
wrong.
gave one last speech.
As Boudicca's
Standing
army
atop
approached
her war chariot,
she gave one
flanked
last
by her
speech.
daughters.
Standing atop
She reminded
her war
them
chariot,
of their suffering,
flanked by
the
her
floggings,
daughters, the rapes.
She reminded
the
them
stolen
of their
lands,
suffering,
the burnt
the floggings,
homes, the rapes.
She called
the
upon the
stolen
goddess
lands,
Andraste,
the burnt
invoked
homes.
the ancestors,
She
and
vowed
vowed on
either
the goddess
victory or
Andraste.
death.
Invoked the
Her
ancestors,
warriors roared in
and
response.
vowed either victory
They
or
believed
death.
the gods would carry
Her
them.
warriors roared in response. Then
They
the
believed
battle
the
began.
gods would carry them.
The Britons charged.
Then
They filled the
battle
field with a
began.
primal fury.
The Britons
but
charged.
Suetonius held
They
firm.
filled the field with a
He let
primal
them come
fury,
close,
packed
but
tight in the
Suetonius
narrow
held
terrain.
firm. Then
He let them come
with
close,
perfect
packed
timing,
tight in the
he
narrow
unleashed
terrain.
the Roman counterstrike.
with perfect
Spears
timing,
flew in tight
he unleashed
formation.
the Roman
Shields
counterstrike.
locked. Spears
Gladi,
flew in
short
tight Roman
formation.
swords,
Shields
cut deep
locked.
into the confused
Gladi,
mass.
short
wave
Roman
after
swords,
wave of
cut
Britons
deep
crashed
into
into an
confused
iron
mass.
wall, and each
Wave
time
after wave
they
of
broke.
Britons crashed into an iron
Then the
wall,
Romans advanced,
and each time,
step
they
by
broke.
step, disciplined.
Then the Romans
precise,
advanced, merciless.
step by step, disciplined.
Behind the Britons,
precise,
wagons and
merciless.
families had followed the army.
Behind the
Expecting to
Britons,
witness
Roman
wagons and
defeat.
families had followed the
Instead,
army.
they became a fatal
Expecting to
obstacle.
witness Roman defeat.
The warriors couldn't retreat.
Instead, they became a fatal
Panic
obstacle.
set in. The warriors
The
couldn't
narrow
retreat.
battlefield turned into a
Panic
slaughter.
set in.
When the dust
The
settled,
narrow battlefield
it was
turned
over.
into a slaughter.
Tens of thousands
When the dust
of Britons
settled,
lay dead.
it was over.
The rebellion was
Tens
shattered.
of thousands of Britons
The
lay
empire
dead.
had bent. The
but not
rebellion
broken.
was shattered.
Boudica
The
had thrown
empire had
everything
bent,
at Rome,
but not broken.
and though she lost the battle,
Boudica had thrown
the memory of
everything
her
at
stand
Rome.
would echo
And
louder
though she
than
lost
the clash
the
of
battle,
swords.
the memory of her
Her
stand
final
would
fate
echo
would
louder
remain a
than the
mystery.
clash of swords.
But her legend was already
Her final
immortal.
fate would remain a mystery.
The battlefield
but
was
her
silent.
legend was already
The
immortal.
roar of war replaced
The
by the
battlefield
moans
was
of the dying.
silent.
The
Boudica
roar
had
of
lost,
war replaced
not just
by
a
the
battle,
moans of the dying,
but a war she had
Boudica
set
had
ablaze
lost,
with her own hands.
not just a battle,
The ground
but a
was
war
soaked
she
with
had
the
set
blood of her
ablaze with her
people,
own hands,
and the ashes of their
The
dreams
ground was
drifted
soaked
into
with
the
the
cold
blood of her
Britannic
people,
air, and the ashes of their
and
dreams
Boudica
drifted into the
she
cold
was nowhere
Britannic
to be
air.
found.
There are
And
no
Boudica,
eyewitness accounts of her
she was
final
nowhere
breath.
to be found. No clear details
There are no
of her
eyewitness
death.
accounts of her final
Roman
breath.
historians offer
No clear
conflicting
details
stories
of her death.
Some say
Roman
she took
historians
poison,
offer
choosing
conflicting
death over
stories.
capture. Some say she
Others
took
suggest
poison,
she fell ill
choosing
and
death
died
over
quietly
capture.
in the aftermath.
Others suggest she
But what
fell
they
ill
agree on
and
is
died
this:
quietly in the aftermath.
She vanished.
But what they
No
agree on is
chained
this:
queen was ever paraded
she
through
vanished.
the streets of Rome.
No chained
public
queen was ever
execution.
paraded through
No
the streets
final
of Rome.
humiliation. No public
She simply
execution.
disappeared.
No
Like
final
a storm that
humiliation.
burned itself out.
She simply disappeared.
But in that disappearance,
like a storm that
something
burned itself
extraordinary
out.
happened.
But in
She
that
became
disappearance,
more than a queen.
something extraordinary
She became myth.
happened. She became
Rome,
more than a queen.
shaken and
She became
humiliated
myth.
by the scale of her rebellion.
Rome tried to
shaken
bury the
and
memory.
humiliated by the
It
scale
was
of her
too late.
rebellion.
Tried to bury the
Boudica
memory.
had become a name whispered
was
in
too
tribal
late.
songs and echoed in the
Boudica had
sacred
become a
groves.
name whispered in tribal songs
To the Britons,
and echoed
she was
in
not
the
a
sacred
defeated rebel.
groves. She was a martyr.
To the Britons,
a goddess
she was
not a
of war
defeated
and
rebel.
vengeance.
She was
A
a
mother
martyr,
who had stood against
a
the
goddess
world's
of
most
war and
powerful
vengeance,
empire,
and made
a
it
mother
bleed.
who had stood against the world's
Even
most
among the
powerful
Romans,
empire.
there was
reluctant
reluctant bleed.
respect. Even among the
Tacitus,
Romans,
though
there
Roman
was
to the
reluctant
bone,
respect.
painted her not as a barbarian,
Tacitus,
though
but as a
Roman to the
formidable
bone,
leader, wronged
painted her
by the
not as a
arrogance of
barbarian,
empire,
but as a formidable
Cassius
leader
Dio
wrote
wronged
of her
by the
commanding
arrogance
presence
and
and terrifying speeches.
Cassius Dio wrote
They
of her
feared her,
commanding
yes,
presence and
but they also
terrifying
admired
speeches.
her resolve.
They feared her,
And
yes,
across the centuries,
but they also
Boudica
admired her
refused
resolve.
to die. And across
She
the
would rise
centuries,
again in Victorian
Boudica refused
statues.
to die. In poems by
She would
Tennyson,
rise again in Victorian
history books,
statues, in school
in
lessons.
poems by Tennyson.
She became
in
a
history
symbol of
books,
defiance,
in school lessons,
especially to women who saw
She became
in her
a symbol
story
of
a fire
defiance,
that couldn't be extinguished,
especially to women who who saw in her story a fire that spiked wheels tearing across time. Her chariot became a vehicle of resistance tearing across time, and so became a vehicle of resistance. Though her body may be lost to history, and so, though her body may be lost to history, it rides with the wind. Her voice never
It
left.
screams in the fire.
It rides with the wind.
It echoes through every soul that has ever stood against oppression and whispered. It echoes through every soul that has ever stood against oppression and whispered. Centuries have passed since Boudica vanished into the mists of history. Centuries, her shadow still lingers across the British Isles of history. But her shadow still lingers across the British Isles. Hear her invoked. You can see her name carved into monuments. And feel her presence. Hear her invoked in political land that never truly forgot her. And feel her presence in the stubborn spirit of a land that never truly forgot her. A bronze statue shows her standing tall near Westminster Bridge, flanked by her daughters. Shows her standing tall on a war horizon, flanked by her daughters raised in defiance. Eyes set on the horizon. Below her, traffic hums and tourists wander, unaware that they walk in the echoes of her rebellion. Tourists wander, unaware her legacy isn't just about statues of her rebellion. It's about what she represents. But her legacy isn't just about statues. Boudica became more than the sum of her represents. She became an eternal question than the sum of her every empire. She became an eternal question every ruler who forgets the power of the people. Every oppressor. Every ruler who forgets the power of the people. She was not perfect. What happens when the silence? Her revolt was marked by bloodshed. She was not perfect. Tens of her revolt was marked by bloodshed and massacres. Tens of history isn't written by saints. Her warriors. It's carved by those who dare to resist. By saints. And resistance by those who dare to resist is rarely clean. And resistance by its nature what makes Boudica endure is not just her war against Rome. What makes Boudica endure is not just her war against Rome. A woman who lost everything and still stood tall. A woman who lost everything to be defined by the empire that tried to break her. A queen who refused to be defined by the empire that tried to break her. Modern historians continue to debate her exact role, her decisions. Modern historians continue to debate her exact role. But ask any Briton who Boudica was. Her motives. They won't recite footnotes. But ask any Briton who Boudica was. They'll tell you she was the queen who made Rome bleed. The woman who united tribes that had once warred with each other. The woman who united tribes that had once warred with each other, even from devastation. The warrior who taught the world that dignity can rise. She becomes more than historical figure, and in that she becomes symbol. She becomes more than historical of rebellion, of courage. She becomes symbol of the unbreakable will of rebellion. Of courage, because even when Rome rebuilt its cities and redrew its maps, because even when Rome rebuilt its cities and redrew its maps, burns. It could not erase every fight against tyranny. Her flame still burns. In every voice that dares to say every fight against tyranny, and in every soul, in every voice that dares to say than live on their knees, and in every soul that would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. But her legend rides forever. Boudica is gone, but her legend rides forever. To the ancients, illness was never random. It wasn't just about bacteria, viruses, or rogue cells. It wasn't just about bacteria would come thousands of years later. Cells. Those explanations would come thousands of years later. Not of physical failure alone, sickness, but of a deeper disturbance. Not of physical failure alone, balance, but of a deeper disturbance in the harmony between body, a disruption in balance, soul, a fracture in the harmony between body. In Mesopotamia, soul, disease was often seen as divine punishment. In Mesopotamia, if someone fell ill, often seen it was believed they had offended a god, broken a taboo, fell ill, or it was believed they had offended a god. Broken diagnosis began not with symptoms, a curse, but with questions. Diagnosis began not with symptoms, who have you angered, but with questions. Priests and healers worked together. Who have you interpreting omens, casting spells. Priests and healers worked prescribing rituals alongside herbal treatments, casting spells, and prescribing rituals alongside took on a more systematic meaning. In ancient China, yin and yang, balance took on a more systematic meaning. Health was the state of equilibrium between opposing forces. Health was the state of equilibrium between opposing forces. Would throw the body off, or cold, dryness. Practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine body off. Didn't just treat a cough. Practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine what time of day it worsened, what emotions accompanied it, what time of day it worsened. Healing was holistic. What emotions accompanied it. Acupuncture, healing, and dietary changes were all tools to rebalance the inner cosmos, and dietary changes were all tools to rebalance the inner cosmos. Rejected the idea of God's punishing people with disease. Rejected the idea of God's punishing people with disease. His theory of the four humours, health as blood, phlegm, yellow bile, theory of the four black bile, blood, dominated Western yellow bile for centuries, and black bile. Each humour dominated Western medicine for centuries. An excess or deficiency of one temperament would cause both physical symptoms and personality shifts. Would cause both melancholic symptoms and personality shifts. Was said to have too much black bile. A melancholic person, for instance, across cultures, was said to have too much thread remained the same. Health across cultures meant wholeness. One thread remained not just the absence of pain. Health, but the presence of balance. Not just the absence of pain. Whether it was the Ayurvedic concept of doshas in India,
Whether it was the Ayurvedic possession of doshas in Indian traditions, or the belief in spiritual possession in African healing traditions, the human being was not isolated. People understood we were part of nature. Being was not and nature, isolated. When disturbed, we were part of nature. So, and nature, when ancient healers laid hands on the sick, they weren't just looking for physical signs. Healers laid hands on the sick. They were listening for imbalance. They weren't just looking for physical signs. And they believed that to heal someone, for imbalance, you had to treat the invisible forces. And they believed that just to heal someone, you had to treat the invisible forces just in the land of pyramids and pharaohs. Wounds. Medicine was both science in the land of pyramids and pharaohs. Ancient Egyptian healers, science called sorcery, SWNW. Ancient were not merely physicians called SWNW. They were sacred intermediaries between the body and the divine. They were sacred intermediaries between the body and the divine, and yet deeply entwined with ritual surprisingly advanced. To the Egyptians, entwined the body could bleed, magic, bruise, and break. To the Egyptians, but its ailments were never purely physical and break. The spirit, but its ailments were never purely physical. And even the afterlife played a role in every sickness. The gods, and even the afterlife, much of what we know comes from medical texts like the Ebers Papyrus. Much of what we know comes from medical texts like the Ebers Papyrus. This ancient scroll contains hundreds of remedies for everything from toothache to tumors. This ancient scroll contains hundreds of remedies for everything from toothache to tumors, set fractures. Egyptian doctors performed surgeries and drained abscesses with copper tools, treated infections by fire, and drained abscesses with copper tools, how to sterilize by fire, how to observe urine and feces for diagnosis, how to check pulses, and how to use a wide variety of feces for diagnosis. Many still in use today. And how to use a wide variety of herbs. No treatment began without the blessing of the gods. Many still in use today. But no treatment began without the blessing of the gods. Was believed to have gifted humanity the secrets of healing. The god of wisdom was believed to have gifted humanity the goddess of war and plague. Was both feared and prayed to. The lion-headed goddess of war and plague. She could unleash epidemics or grant recovery. Was both feared and prayed to. Spells were often recited over a patient as herbs were applied. Spells were often recited over a patient as herbs were applied. Incantations weren't empty phrases. Words held power. They were medicine in sound form. Incantations weren't empty phrases. One of their greatest tools was medicine in sound form. It was used as an antiseptic. One of their greatest tools bacteria were understood. It was used as an antiseptic. Wounds were bandaged long before bacteria sometimes combined with resin or lint. Wounds were bandaged with garlic and onions sometimes combined with resin or lint. Castor garlic oil served as a laxative, prescribed for heart health. Even mouldy bread was pressed into oil served as a laxative. A primitive even mouldy bread was pressed centuries ahead of its times. A primitive Egyptian doctors treated centuries ahead of its time, but also royalty. Egyptian doctors treated not only were respected across borders, but also royalty. Neighboring civilizations were respected across Egyptian physicians for difficult cases. Neighboring civilizations would seek out Egyptian physicians for difficult cases. Some focused on the stomach, in a way, others on the eyes, or even some on spiritual afflictions, others on the eyes. But in all their knowledge, or even on spiritual, there was no separation between the physical and the sacred. In all their knowledge, there was no separation between the physical and the sacred. Or from an angry ghost might come from the Nile's mosquitoes. Healing the body meant pleasing an angry ghost, purifying the soul. Healing the body, restoring pleasing the gods, purifying the ancient Egyptian and restoring divine balance. A healer's true role wasn't just to cure the ancient Egyptian. A healer's true role wasn't just to cure the illness. Long before modern medicine to restore emerged, cosmic order. India was already writing its own story of healing emerged. India was already writing its own story of healing, but as a reflection that viewed the human body not as a machine. This ancient system as a reflection of Ayurveda, a Sanskrit word. This ancient system, the science of Ayurveda, a Sanskrit rooted in the Vedic tradition. The science of Ayurveda is more than just a medical practice. Rooted in the Vedic tradition, it's a philosophy, Ayurveda, a way of living in harmony with nature. It's a philosophy and spirit, a way of living in harmony with nature. Central to Ayurveda is the concept of three doshas. Vata. Central to Ayurveda is the concept of three doshas. Each represents a unique combination of the five elements. Earth. Each represents a unique combination of the five elements. And ether. Earth. Water. Vata governs movement. Air. Pitta controls transformation. Vata governs movement, and Kapha controls transformation, stability, like digestion. Everyone is born with a unique structure and stability. Illness, everyone is born to Ayurveda, balance of arises when this balance is disturbed. Illness, according to Ayurveda, poor diet, arises when this balance is disturbed. Or lifestyle. By poor diet, Ayurvedic stress like the Karaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita date Ayurvedic texts like the Karaka Samhita and These detailed manuals offer not just herbal remedies, but guidance on surgery. Manuals offer not just herbal remedies, psychology, but guidance on surgery for physicians, obstetrics, psychology. Charaka focused on even internal medicine for physicians, promoting prevention as the first line of defense. Internal medicine. Promoting prevention as the first line
is remembered
of
as a pioneer of surgery.
Sushruta,
describing over 300
is remembered as a
surgical
pioneer
procedures
of surgery,
and more than 120
describing over 300
surgical procedures, many carved
more than
from wood or
120 surgical instruments.
One of his most
Many
astonishing
carved from
techniques
wood or metal
was rhinoplasty.
One of his most
Reconstructing
astonishing
a nose
techniques
using a flap
was
of skin
rhinoplasty.
from the patient's cheek
Reconstructing
or
a
forehead.
nose using a flap
This
of
wasn't
skin
cosmetic.
from the patient's cheek.
It was
or
often
forehead.
used to restore faces
This wasn't
mutilated as
cosmetic.
punishment.
It was often used
Thousands
to restore
of years
faces
before Western
mutilated
medicine
as
caught
punishment.
up.
Sushruta
Thousands
had
of
already
years
set the
before
stage.
Western medicine caught up.
But Ayurveda's
Sushruta
strength
had already
lies
set
in
the
its
stage.
holistic approach. But Ayurveda's strength
Healing the body
lies
is
in its
inseparable
holistic
from
approach.
healing the mind and soul.
Healing the body
Treatments
is
include
inseparable
herbal
from
medicine,
healing the mind
yoga,
and soul. Breathing
Treatments
exercises
include herbal medicine,
pranayama, yoga,
oil massages,
breathing exercises,
abhyanga,
pranayama,
and meditative
oil
fasting.
massages, abhyanga,
Plants like turmeric
and meditative
ashwagandha,
fasting.
neem, and tulsi
Plants like
weren't
turmeric,
just food.
ashwagandha,
They were medicine,
neem, and tulsi
purifiers,
weren't
and protectors
just
of
food.
life force.
They were medicine,
An
purifiers,
Ayurvedic healer
and protectors
might treat
of
a
life
fever
force.
not just with herbs,
An
but
Ayurvedic
by adjusting
healer
your sleep
might
schedule,
treat a fever not just
examining
with
your
herbs,
emotional health,
but by adjusting
and
your
cleansing
sleep
your
schedule,
digestive fire,
examining your emotional
agni,
health, and cleansing your
Ayurveda
digestive
teaches that
fire,
you are not separate
or
from nature.
agni.
You are
Ayurveda
nature.
teaches that you are
And
not
when you
separate
fall
from
ill,
nature.
it is nature's
You
call
are nature
to return to
and
balance.
when you fall ill,
it is nature's
in ancient
call
China,
to return.
health was
to
never
balance.
just about flesh and bone.
In ancient
It
China,
was about energy.
Health was never just about
The
flesh
invisible,
and bone.
vital force
It was about
called
energy.
chi, pronounced chi.
The invisible,
flowed through
vital
every
force
living being,
called chi,
and the key to
pronounced
wellness
chi,
was
flowed
ensuring
through
that
every
chi
living
moved
being.
freely.
And the key
Without
to wellness
blockage or
was
excess.
ensuring that chi moved
This
freely.
foundational
without
idea
blockage
would
or
shape one of the
excess.
oldest continuous medical
This
systems in
foundational
the
idea
world.
would shape one of the
Traditional
oldest
Chinese
continuous
medicine,
medical
or
systems in the
TCM.
world. Traditional
To understand
Chinese
illness,
medicine, or
ancient
TCM.
Chinese physicians first
To
had
understand illness,
nature itself.
Ancient Chinese
They
physicians
observed the rhythms
first had
of
to
the
understand
seasons,
nature
the
itself,
phases of the moon.
They observed
the
the
behavior
behavior
of
of
animals,
seasons
and the
the
turning of
phases
the
of the
cosmos.
moon, the behavior
From these
of
patterns
animals,
emerged
and
two
the
core
turning of the
principles.
cosmos. Yin and
From
yang,
these patterns
and the
emerged
5
two
elements.
core principles:
Wood,
fire,
yin and yang,
earth,
and the
metal,
5 elements.
and water.
Wood,
Fire,
yin and yang
earth,
represented
metal,
balance in
and
all
water.
things.
Yin
was
and
cool,
yang represented
dark,
balance
passive,
in all things.
internal.
Yin was
Yang
cool,
was hot,
dark,
bright,
passive,
active,
internal.
external.
Yang was
Every
hot,
organ,
bright,
emotion, and function
active,
of the body
external.
was classified
Every
under these
organ,
opposing
emotion,
but
and
complementary
function of the body
forces. Was classified under
Health,
these
then,
opposing
was
but
a dynamic
complementary
balance
forces.
between them.
Health,
A fever
then,
wasn't just
was a
a rise
dynamic
in
balance
temperature.
between them. It was an excess of
A
yang.
fever wasn't just a rise in temperature.
Fatigue might signal a
It was an
depletion
excess
of
of
yin.
yang.
Diagnosis
Fatigue
was an
might
art.
signal a depletion of
Physicians didn't rely on tools.
Diagnosis was
They
an
relied
art.
on the senses.
Physicians didn't rely
They
on
examined the
tools.
tongue.
They
felt
relied
the
on the
pulse at
senses.
multiple positions.
They examined
Listened
the
to the
tongue,
tone of the
felt
voice,
the pulse
and
at
asked
multiple
questions about
positions,
dreams,
listened to the
emotions,
tone of the voice,
and bowel
and
movements,
asked questions about dreams.
Every detail offered
emotions,
insight into the
and
balance,
bowel movements,
or imbalance.
Every
of
detail
chi.
offered insight into the balance.
To restore health,
or imbalance,
they turned to a
of
vast
chi.
toolkit. To
Restore
restore
health,
health,
they
the
turned to
insertion
a
of
vast
fine needles
toolkit.
into precise points along the
Acupuncture,
body's meridians.
the insertion of fine
was used
needles
to
into
unblock
precise
chi and
points
restore
along the
flow.
body's meridians.
Was used to unblock
the burning
chi
of
and
the
restore
mugwort
flow.
herb near these points.
Moxibustion
was used to warm
the burning
and
of the
stimulate
mugwort herb
circulation
near these points.
was
Cupping
used to warm
herbal
and stimulate
formulas,
circulation.
qigong exercises, cupping
and strict
herbal
dietary
formulas,
adjustments,
qigong
all played
exercises,
vital roles,
and strict dietary
the ancient
adjustments,
text,
all
Huang
played
Di
vital
Neijing,
roles.
or the Yellow Emperor's
ancient
inner canon,
text, Huang Di
compiled around
Neijing,
2,000 years ago,
or the Yellow Emperor's
remains
inner
the
canon,
foundation of TCM
compiled around
today.
2,000 years ago.
It didn't just
remains
list
the
diseases.
foundation of TCM
It explored
today.
causes, prevention,
It didn't just
and
list
lifestyle.
diseases.
It taught that
explored
emotions
causes,
like anger,
prevention,
grief, and fear
lifestyle
could disrupt
It
organs.
taught that emotions like
and that
anger,
healing
grief,
required
and
emotional
fear
balance
could
as
disrupt
well as physical
organs.
remedies, and that healing required emotional
Chinese
balance
medicine never
as well as
separated
physical
the person
remedies
from the world around them.
Chinese medicine
To treat
never
the body,
separated the
one
person
must
from
treat
the
the
world
climate,
around them. The soul,
To treat
the
the
unseen
body,
energy within.
one must treat the climate, the soul,
In every heartbeat,
and the unseen
the
energy
ancients
within.
believed. Chi was speaking.
In every heartbeat,
and the healer's
the ancients
task was to
believed.
listen. Chi was speaking.
In the temples of
and the
ancient
healer's
Greece and
task
the
was to
forums of
listen.
Rome, medicine began
In the
to step
temples
away
of
from
ancient
the
Greece
divine
and the forums
and
of
into
Rome,
the realm of
medicine
reason.
began to step away
But
from
even
the
here,
divine.
the body
and
was
into
still
the realm
seen as
of
a delicate
reason.
ecosystem.
But even here,
ruled by balance
the body
and
was still
temperament.
seen as a delicate ecosystem.
And at the center of this
ruled by
worldview stood a
balance and
theory that would
temperament.
shape Western medicine.
And at the center center of this worldview stood a theory that would shape Western medicine for over 1,000 years.
Developed by the Greek physician Hippocrates, and later expanded by the Greek physician Hippocrates, the theory later expanded by Roman doctors like Galen. 4 fluids. The theory proposed that the human body was governed by 4 fluids:
black bile,
blood,
Phlegm,
each humour
yellow
corresponded
bile,
to an element.
and black bile.
Air, water,
Each
fire,
humour
and
corresponded to an
and
element.
to a specific
Air,
temperament.
water, fire,
A healthy
and
person had these
and
fluids
to a
in
specific
balance.
temperament.
Illness. A healthy person
was
had
simply
these
the
fluids
result
in
of
balance.
too much or
Illness.
too little of one.
It was simply the result of
If someone was
much
feverish and
or
aggressive,
too little of
they
one.
might have excess
If
yellow
someone
bile.
was feverish and aggressive,
A choleric
they
imbalance.
might have excess
A
yellow
sluggish,
bile.
pale patient
A
could be
choleric
suffering from an
imbalance.
overload of phlegm.
A sluggish,
linked
pale
to cold
patient
and
could be
moisture.
suffering
from an overload of phlegm.
Treatment, therefore,
linked to cold
focused
and
on
moisture.
restoring equilibrium.
Through
Treatment,
bloodletting,
therefore, focused
purging,
on restoring
special
equilibrium.
diets, through bloodletting,
baths,
purging, special
the Greeks
diets,
didn't stop
and
at fluids.
baths. They also believed in
the
the
Greeks
healing power
didn't
of
stop at
observation
fluids.
and environment.
They also believed in the healing
the
power of
Hippocratic
observation,
oath still
and
echoed in modern
environment.
medicine.
The
Urged
Hippocratic
physicians
oath
to
still
do
echoed
no
in modern
harm,
medicine,
to observe their
urged
patients
physicians
carefully,
to
and to
do
treat
no
the whole
harm,
person, to
not
observe
just the
their
disease.
patients carefully, and to treat
Hippocrates
the whole
advised his
person,
students to
not just the
consider the
disease.
seasons, winds,
Hippocrates
water
advised
qualities,
his students
and even
to
the
consider the
patient's
seasons,
mood, winds,
healing
water
sanctuaries
quality,
known as,
and even the patient's
Asclepiae,
mood.
named after the
Healing
god
sanctuaries
Asclepius,
known as
dotted the Greek
Asclepiae,
landscape, named after the god
These were more than
Asclepius,
hospitals.
dotted the
They
Greek
were spiritual
landscape.
retreats.
These were
Patients
more than
slept in
hospitals.
sacred
They were
dormitories hoping to
spiritual
receive
retreats.
healing dreams.
Patients slept
Ritual
in sacred dormitories
purification,
hoping to receive
exercise,
healing dreams.
diet, and prayer
Ritual
were all part of the
purification,
cure.
exercise,
It was a
diet,
space
and
where
prayer
reason and
were all
religion
part of the
walked
cure.
hand in hand.
It was a space
In
where
Rome,
reason and
medical
religion
practice
walked
evolved
hand in
further
hand.
with the rise of Galen.
In Rome, a Greek
medical
physician
practice
who
evolved
served
further with the
gladiators and
rise of
emperors.
Galen.
He
A
performed
Greek physician
dissections on
who
animals
served
to understand
gladiators and
anatomy.
emperors.
Wrote hundreds of
performed
medical
dissections
texts
on animals
and
to
helped
understand
standardize
anatomy.
humorism
Wrote
across the
hundreds of
empire.
medical texts.
Though some
and
of his
helped
ideas were
standardize
flawed,
humorism across the
Galen's
empire.
influence endured
Though
for
some of his
centuries.
ideas were flawed,
Greco-Roman
Galen's
medicine, for all
influence
its
endured
mystical
for
origins,
centuries.
began pushing
Greco-Roman
toward a
medicine,
new
for
idea
all its mystical origins,
that the human body
began pushing
was a
toward
system.
a new idea,
Complex,
that the
yes,
human body
but
was
knowable.
a system.
And
Complex,
if understood correctly,
yes,
it could
but
be brought
knowable.
back into harmony.
And if understood
Not through
correctly,
gods alone,
it could be brought
but
back
through
into
reason,
harmony, ritual,
not through
and
gods
the careful
alone,
art of healing,
but through reason,
ritual,
long before written
and the
texts
careful
and
art of
formal
healing.
schools of medicine. Long
Indigenous
before written
peoples around the
texts
world
and
were
formal
healing their
schools of
communities,
medicine.
using
Indigenous
a deeper kind
peoples
of
around the
knowledge.
world were healing
One
their
passed down
communities
through stories,
using a deeper
visions,
kind of knowledge
and hands-on experience
One
with the
passed
natural
down
world.
through stories, visions,
For these cultures,
and hands-on experience
medicine
with the
wasn't a
natural
profession.
world. It was a way
For
of
these
life,
cultures,
woven
medicine
into daily
wasn't a
rituals.
profession.
It was a way of
Seasonal
life,
rhythms,
and sacred
woven into daily
ceremonies.
rituals. Seasonal
Among Native
rhythms,
American
and
tribes,
sacred ceremonies.
healers were known as medicine men and women.
Among Native
But their
American
role
tribes,
extended far
healers were
beyond
known as
physical
medicine men and
treatment.
women.
But
Their
their role
spiritual
extended
guides,
far beyond physical
storytellers,
treatment. Counselors, they were
and
spiritual
keepers of
guides,
ancestral
storytellers, counselors.
Illness was
and
seen as a
keepers
disruption
of
in the
ancestral
person's
knowledge.
relationship with
Illness
nature,
was seen as a
with the
disruption
tribe,
in the person's
with the
relationship,
or with
nature,
themselves,
with the tribe.
Healing
with the spirits,
required more than herbs,
or with themselves.
It required reconnection.
Healing required
Plants
more
were
than
central
herbs.
to this practice.
It required
From the
reconnection.
Cherokee to the Lakota,
Plants were
each
central to this
tribe held
practice.
encyclopedic
From the
knowledge of the
Cherokee
land.
to the Lakota,
What root to
each
chew for
tribe
pain,
held
what
encyclopedic
leaf
knowledge
to
of
brew
the
for
land.
fever,
What
what
root
bark
to chew
to
for
crush
pain,
for wounds,
what leaf to brew for
sage,
fever,
cedar,
what bark
sweet
to crush
grass
for
and
wounds.
tobacco was sacred.
Sage,
used
cedar,
in smudging
sweet grass
rituals
and
to
tobacco
cleanse body
was
and
sacred.
spirit. Used in
Yet
smudging
medicine was never
rituals
just
to
about
cleanse
the
body and
ingredient.
spirit.
It was also
Yet
about
medicine was
intention,
never just about
ceremony,
the ingredient
and respect.
It was also about intention.
Healers often
ceremony,
worked in tandem
and
with
respect.
spiritual forces. They
Healers
conducted
often
sweat
worked in
lodges,
tandem
vision
with
quests,
spiritual forces.
and drumming circles.
They conducted sweat
Illness
lodges,
could be
vision
caused by a
quests,
breach
and
in
drumming
taboo
circles.
Spiritual possession
Illness could be
or
caused
even
by a
soul
breach
loss,
in taboos,
a condition
spiritual
where part of the
possession,
individual's
or even
essence had
soul
fled
loss
due to trauma.
a condition where part of
In
the
such
individual's
cases,
essence had
rituals
fled
like
due to
soul
trauma.
retrieval were performed.
In such cases,
calling the spirit back
rituals
through
like
chanting,
soul retrieval
dancing,
were performed,
or guided
calling
trance.
the spirit back through chanting.
The same deep
dancing,
reverence for nature
or
is seen
guided
in
trance.
indigenous traditions across the
The
globe.
same deep reverence for nature
In the
is
Amazon
seen in indigenous
rainforest,
traditions across
shamans
the globe.
rely on powerful plant
In
medicines
the Amazon
like
rainforest,
ayahuasca.
a
Shamans rely
hallucinogenic
on
brew
powerful
used
plant
not for
medicines like
recreation,
ayahuasca, but for
a
healing insight.
hallucinogenic brew used
They
not
believe
for
the plants
recreation,
themselves are
but for
teachers,
healing insight,
revealing the roots
They
of
believe the
suffering
plants
through
themselves
visions.
are teachers.
In Aboriginal
Revealing the
Australia,
roots of suffering
bush
through
medicine
visions.
includes herbs,
In
clays,
Aboriginal
and
Australia,
rituals passed down
bush
through
medicine
the dream includes herbs, the ancestral era rituals passed down through the dream identity. The ancestral era. Healing here is about balance indigenous identity between body, land, ancestors. Healing here is about balance between these body, systems were never written ancestors in songlines. They lived in the songs. These systems were never written in books. Of the people. They lived in the songs,
to indigenous
dances,
healers,
and landscapes.
modern
of the
medicine
people.
may have its machines and
To
laboratories.
indigenous healers,
But the earth
modern
has always
medicine may
been
have
the
its
first
machines
pharmacy.
and laboratories.
And healing is
But the
not
earth
about
has always
defeating
been the
disease.
first pharmacy.
It's about remembering
And
who
healing
we
is
are.
not about defeating disease.
Across
It's
every
about
ancient
remembering
civilization,
who we are, regardless of language,
across
geography,
every
or belief
ancient
system.
civilization,
There was one
regardless
constant,
of language,
the
geography,
conviction
or
that
belief
healing
system.
required more
There was
than
one
herbs and
constant,
surgery. The conviction that
It required
healing
spirit.
required more than herbs
Whether
and surgery.
illness was seen as divine punishment,
It required spirit,
soul imbalance,
whether
or a
illness was
breach
seen
with
as
sacred
divine
forces,
punishment, soul
ancient
imbalance,
people believed that
or a
true
breach
healing
with sacred
began in
forces,
the unseen world.
Ancient people believed
And the doorway
that
to
true
that
healing
world
began in
was
the
ritual.
unseen world.
In Mesopotamia,
And the doorway to that
long
world
before the rise
was
of formal
ritual.
medicine,
In Mesopotamia,
exorcists
long
and
before the
priests
rise
to
of
battle
formal
illness.
medicine, people turned
Diseases
to
were believed to
exorcists
be
and
caused
priests
by
to battle
malevolent
illness.
spirits or offended gods.
Diseases were believed to be caused
Clay
by
tablets
malevolent
reveal
spirits or
detailed
offended
healing
gods.
rites,
Where chants were
Clay
whispered as
tablets
poultices
reveal
were
detailed
applied,
healing rites.
special
Where chants were
figurines were
whispered
buried
as
beneath
poultices were
houses
applied.
to ward off sickness.
Special figurines
Rituals
were buried
weren't
beneath
separate from
houses
treatment.
to ward off sickness.
They were the treatment.
Rituals weren't separate
In ancient
from treatment.
Egypt,
No
they were
physician
the
worked
treatment.
without invoking the gods.
In ancient Egypt,
Before
no
applying
physician
honey
worked
to a
without
wound or
invoking the
bandaging a
gods.
limb, the healer
Before
often
applying
recited
honey
prayers
to
to
Thoth,
wound or bandaging
god
a
of
limb.
wisdom,
Or
the
Sekhmet,
healer often recited
goddess
prayers
of
to
healing
Thoth,
and wrath,
god of wisdom.
Illness
Or
wasn't
Sekhmet,
just a physical
goddess
attack
of healing and wrath.
It was a cosmic imbalance.
Illness wasn't just a physical
Healing
attack.
meant realigning the
It was a
patient
cosmic
with Ma'at.
imbalance. The principle of
Healing
truth,
meant realigning
order,
the patient
and
with
harmony.
Ma'at. The principle
In many
of truth,
African traditions,
order, healers
and harmony.
called ngangas or
In many
sangomas
African traditions,
used drumming,
healers
dancing,
called
and divination
ngangas
to
or
diagnose
sangomas
and cure.
used drumming,
They
dancing,
spoke with
and divination
ancestors
to diagnose
summoned
and
spirits,
cure.
and often entered
They spoke with
trance-like states
ancestors
to travel the
summoned
spiritual
spirits,
realm on behalf
and
of
often
their
entered
patients.
trance-like states to travel
Herbs
the
were
spiritual
important,
realm on behalf of
but
their
the unseen
patients.
world was always consulted
Herbs were
first.
important,
But
even
the
in
unseen
classical
world
Greece,
was always
ritual
consulted
played a
first.
role.
Even in
In the
classical Greece,
Asclepiae,
ritual
sacred
played a
healing
role.
temples.
Patients
In the
underwent
Asclepiae,
rituals of
sacred
purification,
healing temples,
fasting. Patients
and
underwent
prayer.
rituals of purification.
At night, they slept in
fasting,
encoimateria,
and prayer. Dreaming beneath
At
statues
night,
of
they
Asclepius,
slept in
the
encoimateria,
god of healing. Dreaming beneath statues of Asclepius. These dreams were interpreted
the god
by
of
temple
healing.
priests to guide treatment. These dreams were interpreted
Ritual
by temple
wasn't
priests to
superstition.
guide treatment. It was structure. Ritual wasn't
It
superstition.
gave
shape to suffering. It was structure.
A
language to pain. It gave
and
shape
a sense
to
that
suffering.
the illness had meaning.
A language to pain. Through symbolic acts.
And a sense that the
people
illness
could
had
transform fear into hope. Through symbolic acts. Isolation into
people
connection.
could transform
and
fear
chaos
into hope.
control. Isolation
And
into
more than
connection.
that,
It
and
reminded
chaos
them
into
that they were
control.
not alone. And more than that,
Even
it reminded
today,
them that they
science
were not
studies
alone.
the placebo effect, the power
Even
of belief,
today, science
the healing
studies the
impact of
placebo
intention,
effect.
the power of
The
belief,
ancients didn't
the
need the
healing
data.
impact of intention.
They already understood. The ancients
Sometimes
didn't need the data.
a word spoken in
they already
reverence
understood.
can heal deeper than any blade.
Sometimes a word
Because
spoken
not all
in
wounds
reverence
are visible.
can heal deeper
And
than
not
any
all
blade.
medicine is made of matter.
Because not all wounds are
When we
visible.
think of ancient
And not all
surgery,
medicine is
we
made
often
of
imagine
matter.
crude tools.
When we think of
trembling
ancient
hands,
surgery and
we often
unbearable
imagine
pain,
crude tools,
trembling
the truth
hands,
is far more impressive
and unbearable pain,
and more human. But the truth is far
across
more
the
impressive
ancient world,
and more human.
surgery was practiced with surprising
Across the
precision.
ancient world,
These early
surgery
healers
was
didn't
practiced
have
with
anesthesia,
surprising precision.
X-rays, or antiseptics.
These early healers
didn't have
but
anesthesia,
they had skill,
X-rays, or
courage,
antiseptics,
and a remarkable understanding
they had
of the
skill,
body,
courage,
earned through generations
and a
of
remarkable
observation,
understanding of the
trial,
body,
and often
earned through
brutal
generations
necessity.
of observation, trial.
In India,
and
the
often
Sushruta
brutal
Samhita,
necessity. Written over 2,000
In India,
years ago, the Sushruta
detailed
Samhita,
more than 300
written over
surgical
2,000 years
procedures.
ago,
Its
detailed
author,
more than 300
Sushruta,
surgical
is
procedures.
considered the father of
Its
surgery.
author,
Who
Sushruta,
described techniques
is
for
considered
removing
the
tumors,
father of surgery.
setting bones.
He described
repairing
techniques
hernias,
for removing tumors,
and even reconstructing
setting
noses,
bones,
repairing
a form of
hernias,
plastic surgery,
and even reconstructing
his tools
noses,
were sharp, a form
varied,
of plastic surgery,
and carefully categorized.
His tools were sharp,
Forceps,
varied,
scalpels, probes,
and carefully
and needles.
categorized. Many made
Forceps,
of iron or stone,
scalpels, probes, and
Sushruta
needles.
emphasized
Many
hygiene,
made of iron or
surgical
stone.
preparation, and the
Sushruta
importance of
emphasized
understanding
hygiene,
anatomy through
surgical
dissection.
preparation,
and the
though
importance
this was
of
often limited
understanding
to
anatomy
animals.
through dissection.
His surgical wisdom
Though
spread
this was
far
often
beyond
limited
India,
to animals,
influencing both
his
Islamic
surgical wisdom
and
spread
Western
far
practices
beyond India,
centuries later,
influencing both Islamic
in ancient
and
Egypt,
Western practices
surgical knowledge
centuries later.
blended with ritual.
In ancient
Papyrus
Egypt,
texts
surgical
reveal
knowledge
procedures
blended
for
with
stitching
ritual.
wounds, treating
Papyrus
dislocated
texts
limbs,
reveal
and
procedures
draining
for stitching
abscesses,
wounds,
treating
tools
dislocated
like bronze
limbs,
knives, bone
and draining
saws,
abscesses, cauterizing rods, tools like bronze knives, bone saws, and
they
cauterizing
even
rods
have been found in tombs,
cutting a hole in the skull
they
to relieve
even
pressure
trepanation
or treat head injuries.
Cutting a hole in the
Amazingly,
skull to relieve
many
pressure
skulls show
or
signs
treat
of
head
healing,
injuries.
meaning the patient
Amazingly,
survived.
many skulls show signs
Trepanation
of
wasn't
healing,
limited to Egypt,
meaning the patients survived.
In pre-Columbian Peru,
Trepanation
archaeologists have
to
discovered
Egypt.
hundreds of trepanned
In pre-Columbian
skulls.
Peru,
Often from
archaeologists
warriors
have
wounded
discovered
in battle.
hundreds of trepanned skulls.
Some surgeries
often
were
from
shockingly
warriors wounded
successful.
in battle.
In certain regions,
Some surgeries were
over
shockingly
80% of
successful.
patients survived.
In certain
Based on
regions,
bone regeneration,
over 80% of patients
These
survived.
early surgeons may
based
have
on
used
bone
coca leaves or
regeneration.
fermented maize beer to
These
dull
early
pain,
surgeons may
along
have
with
used
coca
herbal
leaves or
antiseptics.
fermented maize beer to dull pain.
In the Greco-Roman
along
world,
with herbal
Galen
antiseptics,
advanced
surgical techniques
in
by
the Greco-Roman
studying injured
world,
gladiators,
Galen
and
advanced
dissecting
surgical
animals.
techniques
by studying
His
injured
insights into the
gladiators
nervous system
and
and
dissecting
vascular
animals
pathways
laid
His
foundations
insights
for
into
later
the nervous
anatomy.
system and vascular pathways
Roman
laid
military
foundations
surgeons
for later
treated
anatomy.
wounds on the battlefield with efficiency.
Roman military
Using cautery
surgeons treated
clamps,
wounds on the
and
battlefield
ligatures.
with efficiency.
Using
While
cautery,
surgery was
clamps,
always dangerous,
and ligatures,
it was also respected.
While surgery
the
was always
domain of
dangerous,
those brave enough
it
to
was
cut
also
into
respected.
life itself.
It was
hoping
the
to draw
domain
health
of those
from
brave
pain.
enough to cut
These
into
weren't
life
butchers,
itself,
they
hoping
were
to draw
artists
health
of the
from
blade.
pain. These
And
weren't
though their
butchers,
knowledge was
they
incomplete,
were artists of the
their
blade.
legacy lives on,
And though
every
their
time
knowledge
a
was
scalpel is
incomplete,
raised in healing.
their legacy
not
lives on
harm.
every time a scalpel
Today,
is raised in
we
healing.
live in a world of
not
digital
harm.
diagnostics, robotic
Today,
surgeries,
we live in a
and
world of
genetic
digital
mapping.
diagnostics.
We can scan a
robotic
body in
surgeries,
seconds
and genetic
and send
mapping.
prescriptions across oceans.
We can
with
scan a
tap.
body in seconds, and yet
send prescriptions
in the quiet
across
corners
oceans
of modern
with a tap.
medicine, the
And
whispers
yet,
of the ancient
in the
world
quiet
still
corners of
echo.
modern medicine, you can
The
find
whispers of the
Ayurveda in
ancient
yoga
world
studios,
still echo.
Chinese herbal
You
formulas
can find
in pharmacy
Ayurveda in
aisles,
yoga studios,
and indigenous smudging
Chinese herbal
ceremonies
formulas
held in
pharmacy
hospitals to
aisles,
honour patients'
and
traditions.
indigenous smudging ceremonies.
Medical
held in
students
hospitals
still
to
take a
honour
version of the
patients'
Hippocratic
traditions.
Oath.
Pledging
Medical
to
students
do
still
no
take a
harm,
version of the
just
Hippocratic
as their
Oath.
Greco-Roman predecessors
Pledging to
once did.
do no harm.
Just
In
as their
operating
Greco-Roman
rooms,
predecessors
we use
once
precision
did.
tools that trace their lineage
In
back to
operating rooms,
Sushrutar's iron
we use
instruments.
precision tools that trace
Concepts
their lineage
like
back to
holistic
Sushrutar's
care,
iron
preventative
instruments.
medicine,
and
concepts
mind-body
like
connection,
holistic care,
now
preventative
cornerstones
medicine,
of integrative health,
and mind-body
are rooted
connection,
in the wisdom of
now
ancient
cornerstones of
civilizations,
integrative health,
who saw healing
are rooted
not as
in
a
the wisdom
task,
of
but as
ancient
a relationship,
civilizations,
who saw
even
healing
modern
not as a
science
task,
has come
but
full
as a
circle.
relationship.
Research
Even modern
increasingly
science
confirms
has come
what
full
the
circle.
ancients believed.
Research
That
increasingly
stress, isolation,
confirms what the
and
ancients
emotional
believed.
trauma
Can weaken
that
the
stress,
immune system,
isolation,
disrupt
and
sleep,
emotional trauma
and cause
can
physical
weaken
pain.
the immune system.
Meditation,
Disrupt sleep,
once a
and
spiritual
cause physical
discipline,
pain.
is now studied for its effects
Meditation,
on brain health.
once a spiritual discipline,
Forest
is
bathing,
now studied for
derived
its
from
effects on
Shinto
brain
and
health.
indigenous nature practices.
Forest bathing
is prescribed
derived
for
from Shinto
anxiety.
and indigenous nature practices,
And the placebo
is
effect,
prescribed for
healing
anxiety.
powered by belief,
And the
continues to
placebo
puzzle
effect,
researchers who
healing
once
powered
dismissed
by
it.
belief,
Continues
it's
to
easy
puzzle
to see
researchers
ancient
who once
medicine as
dismissed
outdated.
it.
Superstition,
It's easy to see ancient
folklore,
medicine as outdated,
primitive guesswork,
superstition. But when we look
folklore,
closer, we see
primitive
something
guesswork.
profound. A world
But when we
that
look
treated
closer,
illness
we
not
see
just as a
something
broken
profound.
machine,
A
but
world
as a
view that
disruption in
treated
being,
illness not just
a
as a
signal
broken
that
machine,
something,
but as a
somewhere,
disruption in
was out
being,
of harmony.
a signal that
And that
something,
idea still
somewhere,
matters.
was out
Because
of harmony.
medicine isn't only about
And that
treatment.
idea still matters.
It's about meaning.
Because medicine
About
isn't
comfort,
only about treatment,
about being seen
it's
and
about
understood.
meaning,
About
the
comfort,
ancients knew this
about being
instinctively.
seen and understood.
Whether they used
The
chants,
ancients knew this
needles, leaves, or
instinctively.
blades, whether they used
understood
chants,
that
needles,
healing
leaves,
was
or
sacred.
blades.
They
Today,
understood,
as we
that
push
healing
further into the
was
future of
sacred.
biotechnology,
Today,
artificial
as we
intelligence,
push further into the
and
future of
personalized
biotechnology,
perhaps we are
artificial
not leaving
intelligence,
the ancient
and
world
personalized
behind.
medicine.
Perhaps we are not returning to
the
it
ancient world
with
behind.
new tools.
But the
Perhaps
same
we are
human
returning
heart.
to it with
A
new
heart
tools
that still longs
but
for
the same
balance,
human heart,
for wholeness,
a heart
for healing
that still
not
longs
just
for
of body,
balance,
but
but
of
of spirit,
wholeness.
for healing not just of body, but of spirit.
Her name drifts through history like a half-remembered melody.
Her
Sappho.
name drifts through history like a
poetess
half-remembered
from the
melody.
island of Lesbos,
Sappho.
born sometime around
A
630
poetess from the
BCE,
island of Lesbos,
whose voice
born
once
sometime
stirred the
around
hearts of
630
listeners under starlit
BCE,
skies, whose voice
whose
once
words,
stirred the hearts of
even in
listeners under
fragments,
starlit
still
skies,
echo with longing,
and whose words,
unlike
even in
the grand
fragments,
warriors and
still
kings
echo
of
with
ancient
longing.
Greece.
Sappho's
Unlike
fame
the
came
grand
not from
warriors and
conquest,
kings of
but
ancient
from
Greece.
emotion. Sappho's
Her
fame
domain
came
was
not
not
from
the
conquest,
battlefield,
but
but
from
the
emotion.
human soul.
Her domain
She
was
wrote
not not the battlefield and jealousy, but the human beauty soul. And despair. She wrote joy, of love, and jealousy. Beauty, she captured the fleeting moments, joy, a glance, and yearning, a blush, a tremble. She captured the fleeting held moments, them in verse like pressed flowers, a blush, a tremble, fragile yet eternal. And held them in verse like pressed Very flowers. Little is known of her life, fragile yet eternal. No portraits, No diaries.
Very little is known of her life.
What we have are traces.
No portraits.
A few lines
no
preserved by ancient scholars.
What we have are traces.
Quotes embedded in
a few
other
lines
works.
preserved
and
by
the ruins
ancient
of
scholars.
papyrus scrolls
Quotes
lost
embedded
to time.
in other works.
And the
yet
ruins
these
of papyrus scrolls lost to time.
The Greek philosopher Plato called her the 10th muse. The Greek
Centuries
philosopher
later
Plato called
her
her
the
the 10th
translators
muse.
and dreamers would seek
Centuries
her.
later,
Piecing her
poets,
life together
translators,
like an
and dreamers
song.
would seek her.
Sappho
Piecing her
was
life
likely
together
born
like an
into a
unfinished
noble
song.
family on Lesbos.
Sappho
An
was
island
likely
in the
born
northeastern
into a noble
Aegean
family
Sea.
on Lesbos.
An
This was a
island in
place
the
of
northeastern
music
Aegean
and
Sea,
learning, where poetry was woven
This was
into
a
the
place of
fabric of
music
social
and
life,
learning,
where poetry
she may have
was
had
woven
siblings,
into the fabric
a daughter,
of social life,
and even political enemies.
She may have had siblings,
though the records are
a
vague,
daughter, and even
She
political
lived
enemies,
through exile and
though the
unrest.
records are vague.
Moments of silence.
She lived through
and moments of
exile
song.
and unrest. Her
Moments
world
of
was one where
silence
most women's
and moments
voices
of
were
song.
confined to the home or
Her
stifled
world was
altogether.
one where most women's voices were
But Sappho
confined to the
defied
home or
silence.
stifled altogether.
She stood apart,
But Sappho defied
not with
silence,
rebellion,
but with beauty.
She stood apart. She
Not
wrote
with
in the
rebellion,
Aeolic dialect,
but with beauty.
In short, vivid lyrics
She wrote
designed
in
to
the
be
Aeolic
sung
dialect.
to the lyre.
In short, her style
Vivid
was
lyrics
intimate,
designed to be
rich
sung
with
to the
imagery.
lyre. Her style was
Evening
intimate,
star, you
rich
bring back
with
all
imagery.
that the shining day has scattered.
Evening star,
Words
you bring
like
back
these
all that the
outlived
shining day
empires.
has scattered. And then, as quietly
Words
as she
like
appeared
these
in the
outlived
records,
empires.
she faded. And then, as
Much
quietly
of
as
her
she
work is
appeared in
lost,
the records,
burned,
she faded,
buried, or dismissed.
Much of her work is lost, but what remains
Burned,
proves
buried,
one thing.
or dismissed.
She didn't need
But
monuments.
what remains
proves one thing.
Her poems were her monument.
She didn't need monuments.
And today, when we
Her
speak of
poems
passion
were
in
her
verse,
monument.
of love without
And
shame,
today, when
of
we
longing
speak of
that
passion
defies
in
centuries,
verse,
of love without shame,
we are still
of
whispering
longing
the name
that
Sappho.
defies centuries.
To understand Sappho,
We are still whispering
we
the
must
name
first
Sappho.
understand Lesbos.
To understand
The island
Sappho,
that cradled
we must
her
first
voice.
understand Lesbos.
Lesbos was
The
no
island that
backwater.
cradled her voice.
In the ancient Greek world,
Lesbos
it was a
was no
flourishing
backwater.
hub of art.
In the
music,
ancient
and
Greek
philosophy,
world,
it was a
with its
flourishing
fertile
hub of
valleys,
art,
music
olive
and
groves,
philosophy,
and coastal winds,
with its
scented
fertile
with salt and
valleys,
flowers,
olive groves,
Lesbos
and coastal
was both
winds,
a physical
scented with
paradise
salt and flowers,
and a cultural gem.
Lesbos
It
was
wasn't
both a
Athens.
physical paradise
It didn't
and a
need to be.
cultural gem.
It had its
It
own
wasn't
rhythm.
Athens, slower,
It didn't need
more
to be.
sensual.
It
and
had its own
steeped in
rhythm,
lyric tradition,
slower, more
Here,
sensual.
music
and
wasn't
steeped in
decoration,
lyric tradition.
it was devotion.
Here,
The
music
lyre
wasn't
and aulos
decoration,
echoed through
it was
homes
devotion.
and temples.
The lyre
Poetry
and
was
aulos
sung,
echoed through
not read.
homes and temples.
And in this world
Poetry
of sound
was
and
sung,
nature, not read.
Sappho's voice was born.
And in this world of sound and
She
nature,
lived in the city of
Sappho's
Mytilene.
voice was born.
The island's bustling heart.
She lived in the city of Mytilene.
Politics
The
thrived
island's
here,
bustling
and so did
heart.
art.
The
Politics
island boasted
thrived
poets
here,
and philosophers,
so did art.
rival factions and
The
shifting
island boasted
alliances.
poets and philosophers.
Sappho
rival
herself
factions
was once
and shifting
exiled,
alliances.
perhaps to Sicily.
Sappho
amid
herself
political
was
unrest.
once exiled.
Perhaps
But it was
to
always
Sicily,
Lesbos
amid
that drew her
political
home.
unrest. It was her muse.
But it was always Lesbos that drew her
was also
home.
a space of
It was
female
her
community.
muse.
Rare
Lesbos
in the ancient
was
world.
also a space of female
Aristocratic
community.
girls were
Rare
educated
in the
in
ancient
music,
world.
poetry, and ritual.
Aristocratic girls were
Some
educated
scholars
in
believe
music,
Sappho
poetry,
led a kind of
and ritual.
theasos.
Some
A circle
scholars
or
believe
school
Sappho
where young
led a
women
kind
learned
of
the art of
theasos.
lyric poetry,
A circle or
dance and
school where
devotion
young
to the
women
goddess
learned the art
Aphrodite.
of lyric poetry.
This was not
dance
formal
and devotion
education
to the
as we know
goddess
it,
Aphrodite,
but a sacred creative
This was not
sisterhood.
formal education as we know
Here,
it, but a
bonds
sacred
formed that were
creative
emotional,
sisterhood.
intellectual,
Here,
and possibly
bonds
romantic.
formed that were emotional,
Sappho wrote
intellectual,
directly to these
and
women,
possibly romantic.
not as abstract muses.
Sappho wrote directly
but as
to
real
these women,
presences in her life.
not as abstract muses.
She addressed them by
but
name,
as real presences in her
mourned their
life.
departures,
She
celebrated
addressed
their
them by
beauty,
name,
and confessed her
mourned
love
their
with searing
departures,
honesty.
celebrated their beauty.
In one fragment,
and
she
confessed her
writes,
love with searing honesty.
I have not had one word
In one
from her.
fragment, she writes,
I beg you,
I
bring
have
her
not
back
had
to
one
me.
word from her.
These lines
I
don't
beg
come
you,
from myth or
bring her
theatre.
back to me.
They come
These
from a lived
lines
world.
don't come from myth or
A
theatre.
circle of women singing
They
by
come from a
lamplight,
lived world,
weaving emotion into
a
song.
circle of women singing by lamplight.
And though time would
weaving
later
emotion
distort
into
her
song,
legacy, framing it with
and though
scandal or
time would later
speculation,
distort her legacy,
Lesbos
framing
was the
it
soil
with
from which
scandal
her
or
truth
speculation.
grew.
Not just
Lesbos
a location
was
on
the
a map,
soil from which her truth
but a
grew.
cultural cradle of passion.
Not just a location
artistry,
on a map and female
but a
expression.
cultural cradle of passion.
Sappho
Artistry
didn't just live on
female
Lesbos.
expression.
She became Lesbos.
Sappho didn't just
Its
live
breath,
on Lesbos.
its heart.
She became Lesbos.
Voice.
Its
In
breath.
an age when the great
its
epics
heart,
of Homer praised
its
gods
voice.
and heroes,
In
and
an
men
age when
filled
the great
scrolls
epics of
with
Homer
battles
praised
and
gods
conquests,
and heroes,
Sappho
and men
wrote
filled
about the
scrolls
heart.
with battles and
She didn't
conquests.
sing of war. Sappho sang about a trembling hand. She didn't sing of war, a voice that made her body shiver. She was one of the first poets in Western history to write in the first person. She was one of the first poets in Western history to write in the first person. And what she felt was narrating events, longing, feeling, jealousy, and what she felt was love, desire, longing, most astonishing of all, tenderness. She wrote as a woman to women. Most astonishing of all, she wrote as a woman. In ancient Greece, to women, a woman's voice was often confined to the home. In ancient Greece, silenced entirely. A woman's voice was often confined to public life, literature, silenced entirely. Politics, philosophy, public life. These belonged to men. Politics, but Sappho stepped outside these belonged to men. Not with rebellion, but Sappho stepped outside those walls. Her poetry did not rebellion space, but with rhythm. It created its own. Her poetry did not private universe where emotion created its own, but power. A private universe where emotion was not weakness. She did something radical. She named the women she loved. She did something radical. She didn't reduce them to symbols. She named the women she loved. She didn't speak in metaphor alone. She didn't reduce them to symbols. She remembered their laughter. She didn't speak in metaphor alone. The way they braided their hair. She remembered their laughter. In one fragment, she describes the sensation of seeing a beloved. In one fragment, she describes the sensation of seeing that man who sits beside you. He is equal to your sweet voice. That man who sits beside your lovely laughter. Who listens to your sweet voice. It makes my heart and watches your lovely laughter. Here, it Sappho is the onlooker, fast. Watching the woman she adores speak to another. Sappho is the onlooker. Her jealousy is quiet, watching the woman she adores speak to another. Human. Her jealousy is just quiet, a few lines, aching. She captures the full weight of unrequited love. In just a few lines, something every listener the full weight of unrequited can understand. Something every listener. Her words carried the erotic, but never the vulgar. Her words carried the erotic with the care of a painter, never the vulgar. The curve of a neck. She wrote of sensuality with the care of a painter. The way moonlight touched skin. The softness of sleep. She didn't separate beauty the way from moonlight touched skin. They were one. She didn't separate beauty from intimacy. Later centuries often misunderstood or censored her. Because of this, some tried to erase her misunderstood or censored others mythologized her some tried to erase her queerness, but none of others mythologized her heartbreak into tragedy. A woman who none of that diminishes the truth of her voice and bravely about a woman who wrote honestly, not in theory, lyrically and bravely, but as someone who had lived it, deeply, not in theory, openly, but as someone who had lived it. Deeply. Sappho didn't just write poetry without apology. She composed music for the soul. Sappho didn't just write poetry. Her verses were never meant for silent music for the soul. In ancient Greece, her verses were never meant for silent reading. It was sound. In ancient Greece, poetry was alive. Sappho's form was the lyric, breath, short and intensely personal. Sappho's form was the lyric with a lyre, short and intensely personal, stringed instrument, meant to be performed with a lyre, plucked gently while the voice carried the words like a breeze over the sea, plucked gently while the voice carried the words like a breeze over the sea. And it's where the word, this was the heart of lyric poetry. And it's where the poetry wasn't epic, lyrical. It didn't tell long tales of war and gods. Poetry wasn't epic. It was intimate. It didn't tell long tales of war and gods. It was intimate, was a whisper, emotional, a confession, and immediate. A love letter sung beneath victories or in candlelit rooms. A love letter sung beneath victories or in candlelit rooms. Her poems were crafted in Aeolic Greek, a regional dialect. Her poems were crafted in Aeolic Greek, a regional dialect rich in now called the Sapphic stanza. Flowed with a particular beat, now called the Sapphic stanza. 3 long lines flowed with a shorter beat, punchy one. 3 long lines followed by a shorter, punchy one. Like a sigh, it was subtle at the end of a longing thought, like the rising and falling of breath during a quiet moment between lovers, like the rising and falling of breath during a quiet moment surrounded by women. Students. She would have performed these songs surrounded by priestesses. Students. These gatherings, possibly ritual or educational in nature, these were also spaces of freedom, ritual or educational where emotion, song, and body were not fragmented but whole. Spaces where emotion, song, and body were not fragmented. Sappho trained others in the art of composition. Through these performances, creating not just Sappho trained others in the art of composition. Creating not just poems. We can only imagine what it sounded like, but a culture. The soft twang of strings. We can only imagine what it sounded like. Her voice. The soft stillness of listeners hanging on each clear rise of her voice. Many of her poems open not with statements, on each syllable, but with questions or invocations. Many of her poems open not with statements, like the start of a conversation, with questions or invocations. Come to me the start of a conversation, O golden-throned Aphrodite, and come free me from hard care, O golden-throned Aphrodite. These were poems that reached up from hard care to gods and inward. These were poems that reached up. To gods, they feel surprisingly modern to desire. You could set them to music today. They feel surprisingly modern. Something raw and real. You could set them to music today. Sappho still stir something raw and real. And in doing so, Sappho she reminded the world that emotion is music. And in doing so, that every reminded the world that emotion is music. Tremble of voice that every melody, every thrill of touch, and hers is one still echoing, deserves centuries later. And hers is one still echoing. Sappho's poetry we have today Dozens. For every line of Sappho's poetry we have today, dozens. What remains are perhaps hundreds. Are lost. Shards of emotion and sound. What remains are phrases ripped from their original of songs and sound, drifting across time. Phrases ripped from their original songs. Some are complete stanzas, drifting across time. Others are mere whispers. Some are complete stanzas, a sliver of longing. Others are mere whispers, a closing thought, a single without a beginning, a sliver of longing, and yet a closing thought without a beginning. Pulse with life, and yet like embers glowing in the ash of something once brilliant. Like embers glowing in the ash of something once brilliant. Time, war. Why did so much vanish? Time. Sappho's works were once collected into 9 volumes. Organized in the famed library of Alexandria into 9 volumes. These were likely copied in the famed library of Alexandria world. These were likely copied and recited throughout the classical world. Much of ancient literature was lost. But with the fall of that library, much of ancient literature was lost. Many works deemed pagan or immoral were suppressed. Many works or intentionally burned, immoral, were suppressed. Sappho's poetry, neglected, filled with passion, burned. Especially same-sex love. Sappho's poetry made her filled with passion. Especially by the medieval period, she became a ghost. Made her a target. Her name survived, but her voice was nearly became a ghost. Her name survived, but her voice was nearly silent. Preserved in grammars, only through quotations by philosophical works. Preserved in grammars, bits of her poetry escape extinction. Or philosophical works. These fragments were often cited for their style or vocabulary. These fragments were often cited for their style or vocabulary. Still bled through. Not for their emotional force. Then came the feelings still bled through. In the late 19th and early 20th century, archaeologists in the late 19th and early 20th century Egypt, archaeologists thousands of scraps of ancient manuscripts. Egypt, among them uncovered thousands of faded lines of manuscripts. Among them songs that had torn and faded lines of 1,000 years. Bits of songs that had not been seen for over 1,000 years. In 2004, a nearly complete poem was found on a papyrus. In 2004, wrapped around a nearly complete poem was found on a papyrus. Each recovery felt like a resurrection in Germany, and yet so much recovery felt like a resurrection. We read her today in so much remains missing. What we long for we read her today is not just what she wrote, but what she might have said if history had not just what she wrote without interruption, but what she might have said if history had let her speak. There's something hauntingly fitting in this survival through fragments. There's something hauntingly fitting in this survival through fragments. About fleeting moments. Sappho wrote about impermanence through the fingers like fleeting moments. About beauty that slips through the fingers. Her poetry arrives to us not as a monument, perhaps it is appropriate, but as a mystery. Her poetry arrives to us not as a together by lovers of language, but as a mystery of music, a puzzle pieced together by lovers of language, a voice once drowned in fire, the heart still burning, a voice once drowned in fire, too honest to escape judgment. In her lifetime, poetry was too honest to escape celebrated even. As a master of lyric poetry, she was admired. Plato called her the 10th master of lyric poetry, placing her among the divine. Plato called her the 10th muse, yet placing her among the divine. Cultures shifted. Her legacy became centuries past, silenced or scandalized. Her legacy became twisted, silenced or scandalized, depending because she wrote about love. Why? And not the kind history was comfortable because she wrote about love. And not the kind poetry centers on deep affection and desire for women. Much of her poetry centers on praised their beauty and desire for their absence. Confessed jealousy, their beauty, and celebrated their absence. Confessed in her jealousy, world, this was celebrated their intimacy. In the cultural setting in her of Lesbos, world, this was especially not among aristocratic women. In the cultural setting of Lesbos, emotional and possibly romantic among aristocratic women, even close emotional and possibly romantic bonds later generations, even especially under Roman, Christian, later Victorian values, especially under Roman, Christian, and Victorian values. Rather than confront her truth, struggled. They rewrote her story. Rather than confront medieval her truth, scribes ignored her. They rewrote her story. Renaissance translators medieval scribes ignored her. Victorians labelled her a tragic romantic language. Heartbroken over a man. Victorians labelled her even a tragic romantic that she leapt to her death from a cliff over the love of a ferryman named that she leapt to her death from a tale that appears nowhere in her authentic work. A tale that appears nowhere in her authentic work. To erase her queerness. This invented story to make her pain more palatable. To erase her queerness, more conventional, to make her pain more palatable. Some critics reduced her desires more conventional, educational. Some critics reduced her poetry to merely others dismissed her altogether as indecent, platonic. And yet others dismissed her altogether as indecent, even in scandal. And yet Sappho's name persisted. Even in the 19th century, when open discussion of same-sex love was still taboo. In the 19th century, her legacy quietly became same-sex love was still queer identity. Her legacy quietly became a coded symbol for queer identity. Became terms for romantic love between women and lesbian, rooted directly in terms for romantic love between women. She became,
rooted directly
without ever
in her
intending
name
to,
and her home,
a figure of resistance.
She became,
without
a
ever
poetic
intending
ancestor to those
a
whose
figure of
loves were
resistance.
silenced. A poetic
And
ancestor
still today,
to those whose loves were
debates
silenced.
echo.
Who was she?
And still today,
A teacher?
debates echo.
A lover?
A myth.
Who was she?
A threat.
A teacher?
But maybe
lover?
the better question
A
is,
myth?
why
A
are
threat?
we still afraid of her truth?
But maybe the better question is,
Sappho
why are we
didn't
still
write
afraid
to
of her
fit into
truth?
categories.
She wrote what she
Sappho
felt.
didn't write
She
to fit
named
into
beauty,
categories.
confessed
She
longing,
wrote what she felt,
and lived through verse.
She named beauty.
Her
confessed
scandal
longing,
wasn't in her actions.
and lived through verse.
It was in her honesty.
Her scandal
She
wasn't in
dared
her
to write
actions.
desire.
It was in her honesty.
And for that, history
she
tried
dared
to
to
muffle
write
her
desire.
voice.
And for
But
that,
it never could.
history tried to
If
muffle
there
her
was
voice.
one divine presence that
But it
hovered
never
over
could.
Sappho's life and work,
If there was one
it was
divine
Aphrodite,
presence that hovered over
goddess of
Sappho's
love,
life and work,
beauty,
it was
and
Aphrodite,
irresistible desire,
goddess of love.
To Sappho,
beauty, and
Aphrodite
irresistible
wasn't
desire.
just a myth.
To
She was a
Sappho,
muse.
Aphrodite
confidant,
wasn't just a myth.
even a kind of companion.
She was a
in
muse,
moments of passion
a confidant,
and heartbreak. Even a kind of companion.
Many of
in
Sappho's
moments
most
of passion
powerful
and
verses are
heartbreak.
not just about love.
Many
They
of
are
Sappho's
prayers
most
to
powerful
Aphrodite,
verses are not just about love.
Please.
They are prayers to
Arguments
Aphrodite,
made in verse when the weight of
invocations,
longing became
pleas,
too much to bear.
arguments made in verse when the
In her
weight
most
of longing
famous
became
surviving
too
poem,
much to bear.
Ode to Aphrodite.
In her most famous
Sappho
surviving
doesn't
poem,
simply praise the
Ode
goddess.
to Aphrodite,
She speaks to
Sappho
her directly.
doesn't simply praise the
Almost
goddess.
like a friend who's heard
She
this
speaks
pain
to her
before.
directly.
Almost
Come
like
to
a
me
friend
now.
who's heard this
If
pain
ever you have
before.
answered my voice in the past,
Come to me now.
free me from hard
If ever
care.
you have answered my voice in the
Fulfill
past.
all that my heart
Free me
longs
from
to
hard
achieve.
care.
There is no
Fulfill
shame
all
in
that
this
my heart
vulnerability.
longs to achieve.
No fear in expressing
There is no
desire.
shame in this vulnerability.
Sappho's love is
No
never
fear
portrayed
in
as
expressing
sinful or
desire.
weak.
It is
Sappho's
divine.
love is never portrayed as
Something
sinful or
sacred
weak.
enough to bring a goddess down from
It is
the
divine.
heavens. Something sacred
In the
enough to
ancient
bring a
world,
goddess down from
Aphrodite
the heavens.
wasn't just about romance.
In the ancient world,
She ruled over
Aphrodite
attraction,
wasn't just about
seduction,
romance. The chemistry
She
between
ruled over
bodies,
attraction,
the ache of
seduction,
separation, the chemistry between bodies.
To call on her was
the
to
ache of
recognize that
separation.
love could wound just as much as
To
it
call
could
on
thrill.
her was to recognize that love could
Sappho
wound
captured
just
that
as much as
duality
it could
perfectly.
thrill. She didn't
Sappho
idealize
captured that
love.
duality perfectly.
She lived inside its
She
contradictions.
didn't idealize love.
She wrote of its
She lived
sweetness
inside
and
its
sting,
contradictions,
its beauty and its cruelty.
She wrote of its sweetness.
In
and
another
its sting,
poem, she
its
writes,
beauty
and its cruelty.
Love shook my soul
In
like
another
the wind
poem,
on the mountain
she writes,
troubling the oak trees.
Love shook my soul like
Here.
the wind on the mountain
Love isn't
troubling
gentle.
the oak trees.
It's violent,
elemental.
Love isn't
Something
gentle.
that tears through
It's
the
violent,
self without asking
elemental.
permission. Something that
By
tears
placing
through the
Aphrodite
self
at the
without
center of
asking
her
permission.
emotional world,
Sappho
by placing
elevated
Aphrodite
longing
at the center
into
of her
something
emotional
mythic.
world,
Sappho
Her poems
elevated
blurred the
longing
line
into
between the
something
personal
mythic.
and the divine.
Her poems
Between
blurred
everyday
the line
emotion
between the
and
personal
cosmic force
and the divine.
And in
Between
doing so,
everyday emotion, she helped
cosmic
build a
force.
literary legacy where
And in
love
doing
wasn't
so,
just a theme.
she helped build a
It was
literary
form of
legacy
worship.
where love wasn't just
For
a
Sappho,
theme.
Aphrodite
It was a
wasn't
form
an
of
abstract
worship.
deity.
For
She was a
Sappho,
mirror.
Aphrodite
A force
wasn't an
that
abstract
reflected
deity.
back all the intensity.
She was a mirror,
the confusion,
a force
and the
that
beauty
reflected
of the
back
human
all the
heart.
intensity.
And in
the
every line
confusion,
of Sappho's
and
verse,
the beauty of the human
goddess
heart.
of love listens.
And in every line
and
of
replies.
Sappho's verse, the
Like her
goddess of
poetry,
love listens.
Sappho's
and
death
replies.
is a mystery wrapped in
Like her
myth.
poetry, Sappho's death.
No one knows
is a
exactly
mystery
when
wrapped
she
in
died,
myth.
how old she was.
No one knows
Or even
exactly
where she
when
spent
she
her final
died,
years.
how old she was.
Some say
Or
even
even
where
died
she spent her
peacefully on
final
Lesbos,
years, surrounded by the sea.
Some say
and the
she died
songs she
peacefully
loved.
on Lesbos.
Others,
surrounded by the
especially
sea
later
and the
Roman
songs
poets
she loved.
spun tragic
Others,
fables, especially
she
later
leapt to
Roman
her
poets
death from the
spun
white
tragic
cliffs of
fables.
Lefkada.
Heartbroken
to her
over
death
an unrequited
from the white
love
cliffs
for
of
handsome
Lefkada.
ferryman Phaon.
Heartbroken over an
But
unrequited
there's no
love
historical
for the handsome
evidence for
ferryman
that story.
Phaon. But there's
It
no
seems more like
historical
an
evidence
invention
for that story.
A way for a
It
male-dominated
seems
literary
more like
tradition
an invention
to reframe her
a way
love
for a
and
male-dominated
suffering into a
literary
heterosexual
tradition
tragedy.
to reframe her love
It
and
turned the
suffering
powerful
into a
poetic
heterosexual
voice of a
tragedy.
woman who loved women into
Turned
a
the
victim of
powerful
unreturned
poetic voice
affection
of a woman
for a
who
man,
loved women
into a
a
victim
neat
of
ending,
unreturned
perhaps,
affection for a
but a
man.
false one.
A neat
The
ending,
truth
perhaps,
is simpler,
but
and
a
more
false
profound.
The
Sappho
truth
disappeared
is
as
simpler
quietly
and more
as she
profound.
arrived. Sappho
After her
disappeared
death,
as quietly
her work lived
as she
on
arrived.
for centuries. She was
After her
studied by
death,
philosophers,
her work lived
quoted
on
by
for
playwrights,
centuries,
and
She
sung
was
in
studied by
performances across
philosophers,
the ancient
quoted
Greek
by
world,
playwrights,
and sung in
her poetry
performances
was
across
preserved
the
in
ancient
9
Greek
books.
world. A treasure trove
Her
of lyric
poetry was
verse.
preserved in 9 books.
For a time, a treasure trove of lyric verse. But history is not kind to voices that challenge its norms. But history is
the rise of the Roman
voices
Empire
that challenge
and
its
later
norms,
the dominance of Christian
with the rise of the
moral
Roman
codes,
Empire
Sappho's
and
later
openly
the
emotional
dominance
and
of Christian
sensual
moral
poems,
codes,
especially
Sappho's
those celebrating
emotional
female
love,
and sensual
fell out of
poems,
favour.
especially those
Her
celebrating
writings were no
female
longer
love,
recopied,
fell out of
her
favour.
volumes left to decay in
Her
libraries
writings were
that
no
would
longer
eventually
recopied,
burn or crumble.
her volumes left to
Some
decay
believe
in
her
libraries
works were
that would
intentionally
eventually burn
destroyed
or
by
crumble.
early church officials
Some
who saw
believe
her
her
songs
songs
were
were
intentionally
dangerous.
destroyed by early church
By the Middle
officials who
Ages,
saw her
her
songs
name
as
remained,
dangerous, but her words were mostly
By the Middle
gone.
Ages, her name
It would
remained.
take over 1,000
Her words
years
were
before
mostly
fragments
gone.
of her verses resurfaced.
It would take over
Unearthed
1,000
from
years
Egyptian
before
trash
fragments
heaps
of her
or
verses
quoted in ancient
resurfaced.
grammars, unearthed from Egyptian
Piece by
trash
piece,
heaps or
she
quoted
was
in ancient
reborn.
grammars, not through myth,
Piece by
but through
piece,
survival.
she was reborn.
Her death
Not
may be
through
lost
myth,
to time, but through survival.
But her disappearance was never
Her
total.
death may be lost to time.
She lingered in whispers.
But her disappearance was
in
never
stolen
total.
lines, scribbled
She
in
lingered
margins.
in whispers.
In the persistent
stolen
ache
lines,
of voices
scribbled
that
in
refused to be
margins.
forgotten. In the persistent
Sappho
ache
didn't
of
need a
voices
heroic
that
death.
refused to be forgotten.
Her poems were already
Sappho
immortal.
didn't need a heroic
And
death.
in the gaps where her words
Her
once
poems
lived,
were already immortal.
we can still feel the shape
And
of
in the
her
gaps
spirit.
where her words once lived,
Yearning.
we can still feel the shape
Unfinished,
of her spirit,
but never truly gone.
Yearning. Sappho's
Unfinished,
life may be lost
but never
in shadows.
truly gone.
Her verses scattered
Sappho's
and incomplete.
life may be lost in
But
shadows.
her influence
Her
has never
verses
dimmed.
scattered and incomplete.
If anything,
but
it
her
has only grown
influence has
stronger,
never dimmed.
like a candle that
If
flickers
anything,
but
it
refuses
has only
to go
grown
out.
stronger.
Like a candle
every
that
age,
flickers but
someone has
refuses to go
rediscovered
out.
her.
In
In
the
every
Renaissance,
age,
someone
scholars
has
rediscovered
rediscovered
her
her
fragments.
In the
Marveling
Renaissance,
at her delicate
scholars
command
pored
of
over
emotion.
her fragments.
In
Marveling
the
at
Romantic
her
era,
delicate command
poets
of
like
emotion.
Byron and Shelley invoked her
In the
name.
Romantic era,
In the
poets
19th
like
and
Byron
20th
and Shelley
centuries,
invoked her
as
name.
conversations around gender
In the
and
19th
identity
and
began
20th
to
centuries,
reawaken,
as
Sappho
conversations
became
around
a symbol
gender
of
and
queer
identity
resilience,
began to
of
reawaken,
feminine artistry,
Sappho became a
of
symbol of
emotional
queer
freedom,
resilience.
of
Her
feminine
name lives on
artistry,
in language
of
itself.
emotional freedom.
Sapphic.
Her name lives on in language
Used to describe
itself.
romantic love between women.
Sapphic.
Used to
Lesbian.
describe romantic
Taken
love
from the
between
island
women.
of her birth.
Now
Lesbian.
a global identity.
Taken from the island of
These
her
words
birth.
are not just terms.
Now a global identity.
They are echoes of her life.
These words are not
Proof
just
that
terms.
a voice can ripple
They are
across
echoes
millennia
of her life,
and still reshape
Proof
how we
that a voice
understand
can
love
ripple
and
across
expression.
millennia,
and still
Artists,
reshape how
writers,
we
and
understand
musicians
love and
continue to be
expression.
drawn to her.
Artists,
Painters
writers,
have
and
imagined her
musicians
at the
continue
lyre,
to be drawn
bathed
to her.
in moonlight.
Painters
Poets
have imagined
have
her at
translated
the
her
lyre,
again and
bathed
again,
in moonlight.
each version seeking the pulse
Poets
beneath
have translated
the words.
her again and again.
Modern
Each
authors
version
have
seeking the pulse
reimagined her,
beneath the words.
reclaimed her,
Resurrected
Modern
her in
authors
novels,
have
songs,
reimagined
and
her,
plays,
reclaimed her,
and through
resurrected
it all,
her in
one
novels,
thing remains
songs,
clear.
and plays.
Sappho
And through it all,
speaks to something
one thing
universal.
remains clear. It doesn't matter that
Sappho
her poems are
speaks
broken.
to something universal.
It doesn't matter that her
It
biography
doesn't matter
is
that her
blurred.
poems are broken.
What matters
It
is
doesn't
the
matter that her
emotion that
biography
burns
is
beneath
blurred.
the words.
What
The
matters
trembling
is the
joy
emotion
of
that
desire,
burns beneath
the
the
ache
words.
of separation,
The trembling
the
joy of
sacredness
desire,
of beauty, the ache of separation.
These are feelings we all carry.
The sacredness of beauty.
She just found a way to sing them.
These are feelings we all carry.
Perhaps that's her true immortality.
She just found a way to sing them, not the marble
Perhaps
statues
that's
or
her
the
true
scholarly
immortality.
footnotes. But the way
Not
a
the
few
marble
lines from
statues
over
or the
2,000
scholarly
years ago
footnotes
can still make
But the
someone
way a few
pause,
lines from over
breathe,
2,000
and
years
feel
ago
less alone
can still make someone pause,
Sappho's gift
breathe,
was never just
and feel
poetry.
less alone.
It was presence.
Sappho's gift was
She
never
made
just
feeling
poetry.
an art.
It
She
was
made
presence.
longing a form of truth.
She made feeling an art.
And in doing so,
She made longing
she
a
became
form of
more
truth.
than a poet.
And in
She
doing
became
so,
a mirror for anyone
she
who has
became
ever
more
loved
than a poet.
quietly, deeply.
She became a
or
mirror
in
for anyone
defiance
who
of
has
the
ever
world.
loved quietly.
And as long as human
deeply,
hearts break and
or in
heal through
defiance
language,
of the world,
Sappho will remain.
And as long as human hearts
not
break
just
and heal
remembered,
through language,
but felt.
Sappho will remain.
Not just remembered, but felt.